Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to the second day of the European Ideas Forum. I remind you that you can join the debate by using the hashtag EIF21 on social media. You can follow the discussions on the Martin Center website, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. We will start our day by discussing all things digital. To help us do that, I invite you to answer the following poll on slido.com using the event code EIF21. Regulating large platforms through more obligations and prohibitions is good for the EU digital economy. But without further delay, I'd like to give the floor to Eline Chivot, Senior Advisor at the European People's Party, who will moderate today's first discussion, Europe's Digital Decade, Regulate and Chill. Eline, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Anna. Good morning and welcome to you all. Today, I'm Eline Chivot, Senior Advisor on Digital Policy at the European People's Party, and it's a pleasure to have you with me today at the European Ideas Forum of the Martin Center. I hope that you will enjoy our conversation today during the next hour on the ambitious topic, Europe's Digital Decade, Regulate and Chill. To get us started, a bit of food for thought first. The EU has tried to solve very complex challenges when it comes to tech policy, rolling out an ambitious agenda, and the EU is now recognized as a global standard setter when it comes to regulating the online environment, from personal data to AI and competition policy. Of course, these frameworks require continuous efforts in terms of implementation, compliance, and keeping pace with the rapid evolution of the online landscape and of the technologies around it. And at the heart of the approach, what the EU wants to do is to ensure that we maintain and improve our competitiveness, our innovation, our growth, but that also means protecting the market from the side effects of the domination of certain large non-EU tech companies, which in some respects have been shielded from the rules of the game that the EU wants to set. So there's also this need for constant change and update of our frameworks to keep up with that speed and that competition. But piecemeal legislation, some say, is unlikely to be efficient, and European regulation alone may not hold unless we are more ambitious in terms of stepping up and nurturing our own strength rather than just regulating the strength of others. So for the next decade, will we see the roaring 20s also in the digital area if we only regulate and sit back? To discuss all this today, it's a pleasure to introduce you to four speakers. One of them will join us a little later. Thank you all for joining me today to discuss this. Paul Nemitz, you're a Principal Advisor at DG Just at the European Commission. Thank you for being here.
Happy to be here.
Thank you. Evangelos Ouzounis, you're the Head of Unit for Secure Infrastructure and Services at the European Union Agency for Cybersecurity, or ENISA. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me. Good morning.
And we have Hendrik Bourgeois, Head of Government Affairs for Europe and Russia at Apple. Thank you, Hendrik, for being here.
Thanks for having me. Good morning.
Andreas Schwab, who's member of European Parliament for the EPP group, will join us in a few minutes. But first, I'd like to ask you, Paul Nemitz, your thoughts on today's topic.
Well, my thought on today's topic is that, first of all, it would be very wrong to describe the European Union either as an institution which only regulates. That's absolutely wrong. We have huge budgets which we're spending on technology research and development. 20% of the COVID recovery fund will go into digital, but we also have programs of billions of euros for AI development in the European Union. But secondly, I think it's also not good to describe Europe, constantly as a lagger in technology, because that's both wrong and discouraging. I think it's much better to point to the fact that although Google, Facebook, and let's name them, are very big players, and Microsoft too, and Apple and Amazon too, very top of the US stock exchange, there are really a lot of European companies which are very innovative, very competitive, and we have just seen it in the COVID crisis. Where do the vaccinations come from? They come mainly to Europe. So I think it's wrong to describe Europe as a loser when it comes to innovation. The opposite is true. there is a division of labor, of innovation, and some innovation is better in the United States in the digital, and I've just mentioned some of those companies which have been very successful, but there's a lot of digital innovation in Europe too. And I would agree with your thesis. We need to both constrain the power of the big players. We need asymmetrical regulation, and a lot of that is now on the table. And at the same time, we need to empower research and development in Europe, and we need to empower people to get there, to work with these technologies and to get knowledgeable about them.
Oh, thank you very much. I'd like to ask you a follow-up question, because you said it's wrong to say that we're only regulating in Europe, but you know, where are we making progress and finding solutions that are not involving regulatory responses currently?
Well, there are many areas. As I said, you know, we are investing heavily into research and development. It's probably fair to say that in terms of digital infrastructure, namely, you know, building the networks, fiber optics, and so on, Europe is, you know, in different ways in different member states, but some of our member states are world leaders in this. We have technology companies who are very competitive when it is about building networks. So also security technology, much of it for cybersecurity, and I'm sure my colleague from ENISA will talk about it, much of that comes from Europe. So there are really many examples. And let me mention last, there's a lot of American money now flowing into startups in Europe. You know, London, Berlin, Paris, and other cities in Europe have become startup capitals with a very thriving startup scene. We see a lot of Israeli technology development companies, and Israel is a leader in many of the digital companies, also setting up in parallel in Europe. So there is really, if one wants to see it, there is a lot of good news. And there's a lot of opportunities which the European Union is providing, both on the, let's say, macro level in terms of infrastructure measures together with the member states, but also on the micro level in terms of direct aid to companies, for example, the Horizon 2020 program. There's a lot in it for digital players.
Thank you very much, Paul Nemitz, for your contribution. And you're right, I've actually come across an article this morning saying that VC investment in European startups has reached a record high. We have with us Andreas Schwab, member of the European Parliament for the EPP Group. Welcome, Andreas. Thank you very much for being there. I'd like to give you the floor with no further ado.
Good morning. I'm connected from Andorra, and I hope that you have an excellent connection and that you can hear me.
I can. The floor is yours.
I would like to thank the Martin Center for that very topical debate. I think it's very, very helpful that we exchange in all directions on the topic of how to make this law a law that is fulfilling the hopes of not only European citizens, but also a lot of American and even beyond in the population. There are expectations that digital markets get fairer. But by getting these markets fairer, it's not about making them more regulated or more bureaucratic, because the key driving factor, and I have been speaking, Elina, I have to tell you, I've been speaking to lots of innovators, to lots of young people that want to make their business, that want to develop their own ideas. It's about giving these people the chance to fulfill their own expectations and to make their business a reality, to feel free in the globalized digital world. And for that reason, we have to find the right rules. And I think it has already been said in the panel so far, we have to make the right rules for the 21st digital century, to make this century a globalized and fair time. And I think we have all the chances now in our hands, because we see on both sides of the Atlantic, but even in Japan and in Australia and other parts of the world, a very thorough reflection on how to make this possible without making the markets too regulated. And that's, I think, our common aim.
Thank you very much, Mr. Schwab. I have a small follow-up question, if I may. So we're regulating a lot of industries. We've done that with food, with cars, with airlines, and we're now regulating tech. But that is not going to be easier or more simple than regulating any other kind of policy, really. And there's a lot of trade-offs that we have to take into account, that you have to take into account as policymakers. How differently is it to regulate tech from other areas, and how different is our approach in Europe compared to the United States or other nations?
I mean, what we are doing here is, technically speaking, not really regulating. What we want to do is setting brakes to companies that are far too dominant and that have a control over tipping markets. That's different compared to telecom regulation, for example, where we had lots of cables, lots of mobile phones that were at specific moments getting together. Here, it's a bit more general. And I think we are not focusing on the companies like in tech. We are focusing on the markets. And we want apply the general principles that we have in Europe already in place, but that these principles in a digitalized world could not be applied anymore. We want them to be applied on beforehand. And I have to tell you, if I look on the debate that is happening also in the US around the Silicon Valley companies, we have to recognize that there are plenty of brilliant people that have themselves a feeling for what is fair at the moment and what is unfair. And I'm sure that with the rules that we are setting, we will give them also a direction, what is fair and what is unfair. And there will be also a new compliance culture in these companies that will help to make the digitalized world better. So I think if we get it right, we have a unique chance to show that the economy is there at the service of the citizens and of the users, and not only on the shareholders of specific companies.
Thanks very much, Andreas Schwab. Now it is going to be for our third speaker to take the floor. I would like to ask you, Evangelos Ouzounis for ENISA. What is your kickoff for today's topic?
Yeah, so technology is always evolving, and there are always new challenges and new issues in new areas. And in some of these areas, there are, policy challenges, and it is, I think, the responsibility of the European Commission, to understand the gaps, to understand the issues, and together with all the other decision policy makers, to come up with some interesting proposals, to address them. This is what is happening over the years. Most of these regulations are not necessarily defensive, and they are not here to defend, European interests against the interest of others. They are solving practical problems, and I will mention a few examples, like for the NIS directive, which is a regulation for, it's a directive for network information security, and actually helped a lot to develop a common level playing field for the member states. A lot of countries use this and as a basis, to do investments, to put a structure, and we have seen a dramatic improvement, over the years. And this is an example, which is not necessarily, protecting interests of the European Union, but helping, member states, helping the private sector, addressing real problems. And I think most of the policy interventions are in this direction. Second point is what Mr. Nimitz said, that I think it's wrong to focus only on the policy part. There are so many other things happening in Europe, I mean, we have a very long tradition in R&D in Europe at national, but also at the European level. Billions and billions of euros are being spent, to come up with new technologies. The problem, if I can say this, is the commercialization of the research, and this is where Europe is lagging a little bit behind. Used to in the past, but now it's getting much better. So we were working for years and years, in Brussels, to develop the mechanisms for commercializing research results. And now we see an important cut with startups emerging in different parts of Europe. And this is absolutely great. So this gives us great confidence, that things will improve. The third is obviously the internal market. Here, we have in theory a market like the one of the US, but it's not one united, unified single market. So that's why there are interventions, in this direction to improve, to correct here and there, aspects which are, for example, streamlining, let's say, the internal market, and develop through these European players, European champions. And I will give the example of the certification, which was added in the CSA for ENISA, in the Cybersecurity Act, which gives ENISA the role to certify particular aspects, particular areas that will sooner or later develop European champions. And with the size of the European market, with a unified single certification mechanism, then we might be able to develop big product developers that can compete at the global level. We are correcting this as well. I wouldn't call this also a defensive regulation. There are, as Mr. Schwab said very nicely, there are other areas where indeed Europe has to take a little bit of a defensive approach to this. But doesn't mean that whatever we do is always policy and whatever we do is a defensive policy. And there are many more things than developing legislation, I believe. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have a quick follow-up question, actually two of them, but I'll try to limit to one if I can. Well, we just heard that LinkedIn suffered from a huge data breach this week, and maybe that platform may not be the best example to take, but what I mean is that a lot of our companies in Europe depend on those big platforms, right? And if even they cannot ensure, that they can manage cybersecurity threats, then do you believe that we can provide solid alternatives to those huge platforms that will be more secure?
Yes, we can. And yes, we can be better on cybersecurity and privacy matters. And I know that, companies are in their interest to do this. Because cybersecurity becomes a competitive advantage. A lot of companies are using it as a product differentiator, and this is very, very important. They take ownership and they demonstrate that they are, following good practices. They comply with standards, and it's not only a matter of size. Size doesn't give us the reassurance that things are more secure. So we are going to face cybersecurity and privacy challenges in the future. And indeed, big players have financial strength to invest on cybersecurity, but doesn't mean that size means better security. And there are a lot of other players, European players, which are equally secure or maybe even better. And we can definitely trust them, for doing such kind of transactions.
Thank you very much, Evangelos Ouzounis. Now it's your turn, Hendrik Bourgeois, Head of Government Affairs at Apple. I'd like to hear your take on today's topic and also maybe your first reactions to what you've heard. Do you agree that the EU's policies and digital agenda are supportive and not defensive when it comes to, you speaking from an industry's perspective?
Thank you, Aline. Thanks for having me again this morning. It's a privilege to be able to participate in the discussions. Look, I think how to assess the ambitious digital strategy of the European Commission is a very good question. I would say, I'm picking up also on the comments that were made by the previous speakers, I would say four things. Number one, I think it's extremely important to increase digital skills in Europe. There's a huge gap, and it's an imperative, simply an imperative to integrate digital skills in educational systems more and better to prepare for the future, but also to unlock investments and to increase productivity. I mean, the digital compass of the European Commission has identified that 80 or 70% of European businesses find that the lack of digital skills constitutes an obstacle to digital investments. And so that's something that the European institutions need to work on together with member states. And certainly a company like Apple tries to contribute to addressing that challenge. We are partnering with institutions, universities in Europe. For instance, we created an app developer academy in Naples that graduates hundreds of students in digital skills and coding and entrepreneurial skills. So digital skills is of critical importance. On the point of regulation, I agree with what Evangelos said and what Paul said. I think, regulation for sure has a vital role to play in promoting, digital sector in Europe, a vital role to play. And the best example I can think of is regulation that is geared towards increasing, deepening, broadening the digital single market, because it eliminates barriers to investments and barriers to trade between member states of the European Union. And that's incredibly important. And a good example of this is the DSA, the proposed DSA, Digital Services Act, because it enshrines and embraces the principle of country of origin, without which we would see fragmentation in the digital single market, because countries would be applying different rules or interpreting rules differently to preserve the legality of online content. On investment, I agree we should not be too negative, but we also should not be complacent. Commissioner Gabriel, for instance, a few weeks ago pointed out that the share of global venture capital that invests in European startups amounts only to 8%. 8%. That means that 92% of venture capital is investing in non-European startups. Yes, we're investing in Europe in artificial intelligence, but I think the number amounts to 2 billion a year. China invests 4 billion a year, and the United States invests 8 billion a year. And so what Europe needs to do, I think, in this respect, is to complete the Capital Markets Union to unleash more private sector investment in the digital markets. And then the last, but the important point I wanted to mention as well, which I think is of great importance, is that the Commission itself in its digital compass, agrees that the starting point of the European Union is an open digital economy. That means that Europe needs to continue to be open for international foreign investments, foreign and international trade, and international partnerships. And I would like to mention in particular the transatlantic dimension here, which I think Andreas was alluding to. And I think the Commission should be commended and congratulated for taking the initiative of creating a transatlantic technology council, because I think it holds the promise of developing global norms, global rules, global standards for the digital sector, but that are based on shared transatlantic values.
Well, thank you very much, Hendrik, for highlighting the need to complete our digital market and our capitals market, and also remain open and also invest in digital skills. Briefly, I mean, thank you for mentioning all these acronyms, DSA, because I had the DMA on my mind, as we have Andreas Schwab with us today, who's rapporteur of the Digital Markets Act. And you talked about fragmentation, Hendrik, and Mr. Schwab, perhaps you could comment on the fact that, we talked about the global approach of Europe, but also within the EU, you might be struggling with existing laws that, different countries already have, that might have a complicated relationship with the digital file that you're carrying. The German competition chief also commented that maybe the Commission doesn't have the manpower that's necessary to implement this law properly. What is your response, and what is your plan on addressing these concerns and potential conflicts?
Well, my concern is that in the end, we have to get the legislation that is treating equally all participants. And it's obvious that we are focusing on the problems with that legislation. We are not doing legislation because we are bored. And the problem that we have been seeing and observing was that competition policy was too often running behind developments, and too often with measures that were having too little consequences and too little outcome. And to change this, we do that legislation, and therefore we don't do it to jeopardize SMEs or young innovators. We do it to make sure that the market gets fairer and better and more innovative again. And therefore we are focusing on the biggest companies. And focusing on the biggest companies can only be done on the basis of what Emmanuel Macron is always referring to, that if we want to defend our sovereignty, then we can only defend it together. So we need full harmonization. We need one law that is applied all over the place in the same manner, and not under the criteria of one of the national authorities only that have some specific points of views, but under a common understanding, going from Finland to Portugal and from Lithuania to Ireland. And the truth is there always a bit in the middle, and therefore we have to go for a harmonized system. And the DSA, unfortunately, therefore, is not the best proposal, because we have seen with General Data Protection Regulation that a too much heterogeneous system, where member states don't really want also to fight in courts about the European approach, makes Europe weaker than we are. So the question will be, how can we make a harmonized system that uses all the resources that are at the disposition of us in the European Union and in the member states? And so the cooperation between the European Union and member states will be crucial. And I have just written as a rapporteur of the DMA a letter to the European Commission and to national competition authorities, that they come up with proposals even to improve how this cooperation can be boosted. And I'm looking forward that we can get it done. And then I would like to come back on what has been said already. In the end, having a different approach, what a gatekeeper is in the US or in Europe, would be a bit strange, because in the end, we want to have a better market in the US and in Europe. And therefore, we will have next week also an exchange of views with our American counterparts in Congress to discuss with academics about their recommendations on how making these markets, let's say, fairer, even, and fairer. And we will see what gets out, but I think it will be of utmost importance to try to find a common approach on this in the interest of the citizens all over the world in the end.
Thank you very much. I think you are also proposing this high-level panel, to ensure there's better cooperation between EU authorities and member states' authorities. Now, still on the DMA, and before we turn to our audience, I'd like to get back to you, Hendrik, because a few weeks ago, Tim Cook said that, although the DMA was overall taking a positive approach, he said that it could lead to privacy and security risks. He mentioned something about sideloading, and I was wondering if you could explain a little bit better what is the problem and to what extent would that consequence of the DMA should be something we should avoid.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Eileen.
You're on mute.
So Apple is, I am on mute?
There you go, I can hear you.
Okay, sorry about that. Thanks for the question. So Apple is a company that keeps the interest of the consumer central in everything what it does. It focuses on the consumer experience, but also on the privacy, the safety, and the security of our consumers. It's really an obsession at Apple to protect the consumer. And we also have a curated approach towards putting content online. That means that we have human professionals, not algorithms, human professionals that review apps before we put them on the App Store. And we look whether those apps are obviously legal, but also whether or not those apps are risk endangering the privacy, the security, and the safety of the users of Apple devices. And we call that a curated approach. And that approach has functioned very well because it protects essential rights and interests of our consumers. And the DMA, as proposed by the European Commission, proposes to mandate so-called sideloading, which would basically mean that Apple, for instance, would have to allow consumers to download apps directly from the internet, and in that way bypassing these essential and incredibly important safety, security, and privacy mechanisms that Apple has put in place. And we think that's a bad idea. We think that would reduce and degrade not only the consumer experience, but also the safety and the privacy of digital users and also digital businesses. And so I think it's very important at the end of the legislative process, and that's why, you know, people like Andreas have a very important role to play here. At the end of the process, that, you know, legislators and EU institutions can guarantee to European consumers and European business users that the DMA is not going to reduce privacy, safety, and security protections. And that is why I think my CEO, Tim Cook, had made that comment last week. And we hope, of course, that during the legislative discussions in Parliament and in Council, that this issue will be addressed.
Thank you very much, Hendrik Bourgeois. Now I would like to turn to Anna and give you back the floor for our audience responses to the Slido survey.
We do have the results back from our poll, and the overwhelming majority thinks that yes, regulation is a good thing for the EU's digital economy, but to the extent that it's not adverse for consumers and business users. I also have a couple of questions from our online viewers. The first question asks, do you think some member states may have reservations or difficulties implementing the Digital Services Act and Digital Markets Act? Ireland comes to mind, and its many tech companies. And the second question is, regarding digital policies, how important it is to have harmonized measures at the EU level to protect citizens? Eileen, over to you for the answers.
Thank you very much, Anna, and thank you for these interesting questions. I believe that we have addressed partially through MEP Schwab those questions about the potential difficulties that implementing these proposals will have. So maybe I'd like to have your take, Paul Nemitz, on this question of implementation across the EU and reservations of member states, and also the importance of harmonized measures, if you don't mind giving your perspective.
Certainly. So I think the issue today is free riding. And there are two types of free riders. First, if we have rules which are not binding, so voluntary self-regulation and so on, then we have some companies who want to do good, but many are not, and they are the free riders. And that's a problem, and that's why it's good that we're moving to binding regulation for all. In some cases asymmetrical, meaning the bigger players and the more powerful players, and this is about power, have more obligations than the other market participants. That's the first point. But there's another type of free riding, which is to participate as a state in the European Union system and have the benefits of the internal market, but then not play ball when it comes to protecting all citizens through the enforcement of the common law. And this is an issue which we need to address in Europe. And it's both an issue of law, how the law is constructed, but it's also an issue of attitude. To say it very clearly, the enforcement authorities today, the national enforcement authorities, whether they are national judges, national competition authorities, national data protection authorities, and also the future digital coordinators under the DSA, all of them should not see themselves as national authorities anymore, because all of them have the duty in relation to the companies which have a seat in their country to enforce the law for in the name and in the interest of all citizens in Europe. So these authorities become European authorities. So it is wrong that the Data Protection Authority of Ireland sees itself as a national data protection authority. No, it has the duty to protect all citizens of Europe when it comes to data protection in relation to the companies which have their seat in Ireland, like most of the big GAFAM have. And the same is the case, of course, in Luxembourg, and for that matter, in any other member state. And this is something which we must bring home to the governments and to the authorities. And if it doesn't work through a culture change, and through goodwill. And I'm still hopeful that there is a development possible here, because we have seen it with national judges. National judges have really understood this. The judges of Ireland, they have understood. They are protecting people from all over Europe, and that's why many of the great preliminary requests for ruling to the European Court of Justice come from Irish judges. But if these systems don't work on the basis of good understanding and culture, if these authorities are not helped and don't manage to take up their European vocation, then we must change the law. And I already see that, for example, in the DSA, the mix between central and decentral enforcement is different than in GDPR. I think I'm very much in favor of having a good culture of cooperation and trust, that all citizens must be able to trust all authorities in the member states, and in particular citizens from other member states, because they are the ones who call them for help. But if this doesn't work, well, then in the end, the only solution is that we have centralized enforcement. And I would say there are also some good arguments in favor of strengthening central elements of enforcement, in particular when it comes to the global big players. It is a little bit, let's say, it can be seen as a little bit naive to think that with the biggest companies on the stock exchange, which I call the GAFAM, Google, Facebook, Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, we have these 27 authorities dealing with them. No, if that doesn't work, and in some areas there are signs that it hasn't worked or will not work, then we must move to central enforcement. And, the United States is an example. The FTC is a very strong enforcement body, by the way, an enforcement body which brings together both competition law and privacy enforcement. And this is another point I would like to make at this occasion. We have a huge fragmentation between sectors of enforcement in Europe. For every piece of law, we have specific enforcement bodies. But the digital economy is an all-purpose technology economy. It's an economy of platforms which are present in many sectors and do many different things. And so I think in the longer run, we also have to rethink this sectoral fragmentation of enforcement bodies. We may have to bring enforcement bodies together for digital purposes. So to conclude, two issues of free riding and fragmentation, the geographic issue and the sectoral issue, and both need to stay on the agenda.
Thank you very much, Paul, for addressing the audience questions so well. And I saw that MEP Schwab, you were giving the thumbs up and nodding. So I'd like to have your reaction perhaps on Paul's thoughts. And also because we're talking about fragmentation, free riding, okay, but we're also talking about new laws, right? And I'm thinking the Commission, they recently opened an investigation into Google's advertising business. And I'm just wondering, what would the DMA solve that the existing laws that we have cannot solve? I mean, why is it important and relevant to add more laws? MEP Schwab.
Well, in fact, we don't want to add more law. We want to make the existing law more pertinent and want to make it being applied ex ante and not only ex post. We want that compliance with EU law has to be done already when the companies start their work on the computer programs that nowadays are called algorithms, but are pure business practices. And like that, the Commission can intervene much faster, much earlier, and much tougher. And secondly, a single market is only as strong as its laws make it, and as its authorities enforce them. And therefore, obviously, harmonization is the strongest tool that we have to face these companies. And they have taken some advantages from the decentralization of authoritarian powers, as Paul has already mentioned. And for that reason, it's a bit surprising that the member states would like to apply the DMA at the same time. Now, why do they frankly see an advantage there? because they have the experience that in some cases at member states level, there is much less political respect, there is much less political sensitivity when authorities start an investigation compared to the EU level. And therefore, we must make sure that the EU level, Elin, is always strong and facts-driven and is not too much looking to Washington, looking to China, looking somewhere else. Because in the area of competition policy, in the area of market regulation, it's just about applying the law against anyone who is not compliant. And that principle, I think, will help us. And therefore, I think we need a very strong tool to apply the DMA, which is nothing else than a facilitation of existing competition law principles that are well known. And I'm always saying, what is not forbidden, clearly, doesn't mean that it's allowed. But with that area of gray zone, these companies are playing a bit. And unfortunately, there are some companies that are doing that a bit worse than others, but we have to admit that these tipping markets that they control and where they use the power from one market into another is unfortunately something they have in common. There is not the good one. And therefore, we have to make these laws being applied to all of them in the same manner, fixing the problems where they are. And we want to do the best. And we want also to make sure, and I have made myself an amendment on that, that we don't want to allow circumvention of these principles that are in Articles 5 and 6 of the Digital Markets Act, because we want these laws to be respected from their value, from their reflection behind, and not by the word of the law.
Thank you very much, Amifi Schwab. Yeah, I do agree that there's a strong competition agenda, for instance, also on the US side, but I was wondering whether it'll mean that they will accept our approaches and principles. And I wanted to turn to you, Evangelos, perhaps, because I think the transatlantic relation came up a couple of times in the discussion, and especially on cybersecurity. This is one of the key areas where both partners are working on intensely. And can the EU approach be helpful? Can be supportive of that partnership, or what kind of impact do you foresee?
Yeah, so I can say that the European approach is probably one of the best in the world because it faces the challenges of distributed ownership and cooperation. And this is actually the biggest problem, in cybersecurity, how different states cooperate, to address a problem like this. And in the European Union, we have a tradition now with ENISA, 18 years or 20 years, we have also a regulatory portfolio developed with the NIS Directive 1, now the NIS Directive 2, e-privacy, we have the CSA, the certification. So we are very well advanced, and many countries, a few countries have excellent, cybersecurity capabilities. And we have a very proactive business community, companies who are taking ownership and do a lot of stuff for critical sectors. So I believe that what Europe has done is actually an example for other continents, because this is the only way to solve the problem, to collaborate, to share information and, agree on norms, on standards, and so on. So I think that definitely other continents can benefit from us. And collaborating with the US, which has a very important technology base, as we discussed before, is also actually in quite interesting experience. And also at the public level, public authorities can benefit. This is a sensitive matter, cybersecurity, and the member states obviously have, their own priorities, their own sensitivities, and they have also their own collaboration with the states at individual state level. So the collaboration needs to be properly focused, and there should be proper priorities on this. But absolutely, there should be some dialogues and some discussion. It's absolutely important, and I think other countries can benefit from us, can benefit, from the way that we are addressing and solving the problem. And the knowledge and the experience of ENISA, I can tell you, is already copied, a lot by other organizations. We are, implementing policy. We are helping member states, to be fit for purpose. We are helping them with the capacity. Slowly, we offer other kinds of services like the certification, maybe in the future, be involved in assisting member states in operational cooperation. These are all elements, that other countries find very interesting because this is how they want also to solve the problem themselves. So I think Europe can contribute a lot in this dialogue.
And thank you very much. And also the Commission launched this joint cyber unit, which looks promising to make sure everyone is working together on addressing cybersecurity, because it was quite a terrible year for this indeed. I have a follow-up question, because you've heard Hendrik's comments and concerns regarding, the impact of the DMA potentially on security. To what extent do you believe that the DMA as a proposal, but also perhaps other digital policy proposals, are focusing enough on cybersecurity and not at the expense, focusing on privacy at the expense of cybersecurity? Do you think there's enough attention paid to that?
I think, yes, there is some coverage of the topic of cybersecurity and privacy. These are horizontal matters. We have explained them just before, that they are cross-cutting and they are important not only for technology themselves, for sectors. So there should be an approach to this. And I think there is enough privacy and security aspects covered, not in all policy initiatives, but that's the thing. If you somehow copy and paste, cybersecurity and privacy provisions in different legal instruments, then you have a problem with coordinating this and aligning them and making sure, that they are compatible. So we have to be a little bit careful, how we do these connections, and keep also a focal point where these things stay. Don't forget that technology is an evolving area. And, if we need to update, if we need to change such kind of provisions, it will be very difficult to do this in 5 or 7 different legal instruments. So we have to manage the complexity.
And one more question as well. What is your evaluation or assessment, of the role of the private sector when it comes to... Oh, I'm so sorry. I think you wanted to add. Just first, a quick question for you, Evangelos, and then I go to you, MEP Schwab, if I may. So just please comment on the role of private sector players in how their ecosystem contributes to cybersecurity.
Yeah, look, the assets, the digital assets, are at the hands of the private sector. They are the ones who should be responsible, and they are the ones that actually, do their best to offer the best possible security and privacy. It is in their business interests. We say this many times. And I know that a lot of companies actually do this, and they do investments, they, recruit people, they make sure that they have the right governance structure, and so on. So that's absolutely important. At the same time, of course, the role of the public sector is different, and there should be a proper division of roles and responsibilities. And but still, a very organization who takes privacy and security, as a key objective is always important, and we say that. And if, however, some companies don't recognize, this, then obviously the legislator, the policymaker comes, to address the gap.
Thank you very much. And back to our legislator then, MEP Schwab. We have time for one last round of reactions.
Yeah, I think we are a bit close to the end of the discussion. I would be very short. I think there can be no doubt that legislation that will be done has to respect the principle of safety of services, of cybersecurity as a common principle. And for sure, private companies that offer services have to make sure that they are resilient and cyber secure. And gatekeepers will have the power and the need to make sure that all offers are respecting this. But we cannot allow that cybersecurity concerns are used somehow as a, if I may say a bit negatively, as a scapegoat for other unfair business practices. So it's up to the gatekeepers in the end to prove that the measures that they have taken are only there and only for that to make cybersecurity a reality. I think there is still some more information to be given to authorities. But the principle of cybersecurity is accepted all over the place.
Thank you. And I still wanted to ask you one last quick question, MEP Schwab. So, you know, Facebook's CEO, Nick Clegg, he said that the EU should avoid laws that would fossilize product design features that would be too specific because it wouldn't work with, you know, given the pace of technological advances. So overall, you know, the criticism is that our laws are not able to keep pace with the technological development. I was wondering, what would you respond to this sort of criticisms?
Well, there are plenty of criticisms, and they are a bit strange because, you know, in the Eastern Republic of Germany, for 50 years, the government, which was not democratically elected, also said, you don't need different offers, you don't need different shops. There will be in every city one shop and you will find everything there. And it has turned out that people have been discovering that in that shop, in the end, there was nothing anymore what they wanted to have. They wanted to have what was offered in the Western German Republic. And that's the best proof that that concept of monopolies being the solution to consumer interests is a fake story. This is ridiculous. The market makes it happen. The market creates the offers that the variety of consumers is looking for. And therefore, we have to make sure that innovation and market development competition is boosted and not what consumers may at first sight like with only one service that they have to operate on. So I think we should always value the argument and being frank and open to discuss about it. And for sure, some arguments are very helpful, but some arguments are also just misleading the debate. And we are aware of that, and we won't fall into any trap with that debate.
Thank you very much, MEP Schwab, and best of luck with this. And I think the message was well received. Hendrik Bourgeois, I would like to give you the floor one more time before we close the panel, if you have any reactions.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to react to Andreas's comments, which I think to a certain extent were helpful, because he recognizes that companies have legitimate concerns with respect to privacy, security, and safety rights. I think the issue or the problem is that the draft regulation proposes an ex-ante approach, which gives very little room. Which gives very little.
Keep talking, Hendrik. I think it's just a technical problem.
All right. As I was saying, the problem with the ex-ante approach and the regulatory approach which is being proposed in the DMA is that it gives very little room for a real regulatory dialogue with the public authority. What is being proposed in reality is a compliance dialogue, but not a dialogue on whether or not the obligation should be applied in the first place, given existing security, safety, and privacy risks. So that's one problem. And then the other thing that I would like to end up with is that, yes, the DMA is addressing existing challenges that result from one could say the failure of competition law with respect to certain digital platforms. And I would say that the difficulties that competition law has been facing was with business models that are pursuing ad-based business models that collect, process, and sell personal data for advertisement spaces that are able then to sell, zero-priced services and goods. And there's no sufficient distinction in the DMA between the various business models. And because of that lack of distinction, I would argue that it could lead to undesirable consequences and unexpected consequences. And so I think distinction and differentiation between the business models of those digital players is of extreme importance, because otherwise it could lead to regulatory failure. But I certainly look forward to continue engaging in the debate and the discussions with Andreas Schwab and other members of the European Parliament, and also of the European Council, of course, in this very important legislative initiative. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you to the three of you for joining today and for your dynamic. And we have Paul Nemitz back. Would you like just 1 minute? You have 1 minute to give us your final comments.
Yes, I would like to react to the statement you've quoted from Facebook and Nick Clegg that the law is always behind. I have created a transatlantic reflection group of academics on democracy and the rule of law in the age of artificial intelligence. And this manifesto is on the internet at the address of the AI Essence Roundtable. And in this group, we have discussed these matters and we found an agreement on very many points which pertain to the relationship between democracy, the rule of law, and the digital sphere. And I think that can make us optimistic that democracy and the rule of law are the prime instruments to deal with the digital future. Let's not kid ourselves. We are discussing here very technical things and they sound like they are only for geeks and insiders. But actually, these rules on how we regulate digital, they determine how democracy functions and how fundamental rights are delivered and how the rule of law functions in the future in both sides of the Atlantic, in the US and in Europe. And that's why it's very important to have a broad engagement in these debates and not leave it to Nick Clegg, and other corporate representatives and the technology geeks and the engineers, but this needs broad engagement and a broad democratic debate.
Thank you very much, Paul. I think this is a great conclusion to our discussion, and I know it doesn't end here, but at least for today, thank you very much again for joining us, the four of you, and thank you to our audience for following. I wish you an excellent day in the company of the Martens Center at the European Ideas Forum. Back to you, Anna.
Thank you, Eileen, for that very great debate. Ladies and gentlemen, please join us for a virtual coffee break, and we will see each other again in 15 minutes for an interview with a special guest. Tune in at 11:15. Dear viewers, welcome back. It is my great pleasure to introduce to you our guest, EPP President and former President of the European Council, Donald Tusk, interviewed by the Martin Center project assistant, Sandra Pasaric. Sandra, looking forward to the interview.
Thank you, Anna. Indeed, it is our utmost honor to have here live with us from a studio in Brussels, the EPP President, Mr. Donald Tusk. Hello and welcome, Mr. President.
Hello. How are you? Fine.
I'm good. Yes. In order to navigate our audience a little bit through the interview, I would like to stretch out and highlight some of the topics that we are going to address during today's interview. First, we will start off with the European economic recovery and the lessons learned from the COVID-19 crisis. Moving on to the EU geopolitical relations with the US, Russia, China, and the newly established EU-UK relations. And we will finalize this interview with the President's personal experience, political experience, and his also outlook for the future of Europe and for the future of the EPP. If you agree, Mr. President? The COVID-19 crisis influenced lives of all our citizens across the continent. Some are arguing that the EU's reaction was not timely. Others are praising the strong signal of EU solidarity and unity. What we know for sure is that the pandemic went hand in hand with the new EU long-term budget for 2021 to 2027, worth 1,074.3 billion euros. Together with the Next Generation EU Recovery Instrument, it allows the EU to support its member states on their recovery path after the pandemic. Mr. President, how do you evaluate the overall performance of the EU during the pandemic? And according to you, what would be the priorities on which the EU should set its focus in the time to come?
You're absolutely right. There is still a question, a political question, about the effectiveness of the EU as a whole during the pandemic, especially when it comes to the most dramatic first weeks of the pandemic. And objectively, yeah, it was a dramatically difficult situation, like all the catastrophes. The problem is that no one is prepared for catastrophe. This is the nature of catastrophe, that no one is prepared for such a scenario like pandemic. Even if someone can claim that so many alarms, so many intellectuals, including Mr. Gates, for example, that they alarmed us that this is something possible also in the 21st century. But frankly speaking, no one was prepared for the fact. It's quite easy to discuss about this, but it's much more difficult to be really prepared emotionally, logistically, etc., etc. And but the truth is that if someone could say about it themselves that is able to give a real lesson about solidarity in the time of pandemic, it's the EU, it's Europe. We have to remember that the EU was focused not mainly or even only how to fight against the virus, how to fight against all the consequences of pandemic, but our challengers or opponents, not to use the word enemies, but I'm talking about China and Russia, of course. They, and it was absolutely clear from the very beginning of pandemic that the intention was also to use pandemic as opportunity to attack or at least to undermine our reputation and the position of the EU. It's not so easy to fight on, on
both fronts.
At the two front. Yeah, exactly. It's today, and I was always a little bit skeptical when it comes to too positive propaganda, and it's my method to communicate also with the people to be to at least to try to tell the truth, not this sometimes typical Brussels, only positive message. But the truth is that the EU is the only place in the world where the solidarity was not only the slogan, and that the moral dimension, this ethical dimension of politics was also very, very visible and is visible in our efforts in our fight against pandemic. And green passports, recovery funds, I mean, the next generation program, and vaccine, investment in science, then vaccine, then the vaccination rollout. This is what we can be proud of, even if we have also good reasons to be still aware that we are still in the middle of the storm. If someone asks me, what do you think about this post-pandemic time? I think it's like a, dark sense of humor. It's post-pandemic.
Is it
My
post,
God,
yes?
it's not today for sure. It's, and I'm not talking only about this possible fourth phase, like Delta plus, etc. But we have to be aware that pandemic and all consequences of pandemic, it's really something permanently present with us. And the most important lesson when it comes to pandemic is that we shouldn't forget about pandemic in our daily also behaviors. This is something what we should be aware of, that our life anyway changed and will change also in the future because of this new circumstance.
Indeed, as you said, and as you stressed out, it's still not yet the post-pandemic, as we can see that the COVID crisis is still indeed with us, and the preoccupations, obviously, of the new Delta virus, and the consequences are still going to be seen. Coming back to the Recovery and Resilience Facility, which was met about a month ago on the 31st of May by all 27 EU member states. How do you, you know very well the EU heads of states and governments, some of them, they're still in the office when you were also president of the European Council. How do you comment the strong signal of solidarity and responsibility shown by all 27 EU member states?
Okay. Recovery funds and the common decision about also common debt, because this is maybe not a revolution, but this is the something really new and significant when it comes to the decisions on the level of the European Council. But this is more about pragmatism than solidarity, frankly speaking, because as I said, it's a common interest, and no one, frankly speaking, no one has to sacrifice something in this program. We have only benefits. Solidarity means readiness to sacrifice something for example, for the weaker, or it's quite natural that in the EU, almost all of our partners are and were ready to show this solidarity because of this very specific, unique moment of panic, of threat, and pandemic is like a war. Mm-hmm. And then it's quite easy to provoke these positive emotions and this positive need like solidarity. But what we need in the EU is a solidarity as a philosophy, not as a, authentic and spontaneous reaction of some threats or solidarity. And this is also our legacy, Christian Democrats' legacy. In fact, this is the political essence of Christianity, to be ready for solidarity as a permanent approach, not as just a reaction for some threats. And I know that I'm sure that you will ask also me about other aspects of recovery fund, like conditionality, rule of law, but it's maybe the best moment now to mention the problem of the deeper sense of solidarity, which is also respect for the weaker, for respect to our fundamental values. This is also what I feel much interesting dimension of solidarity, to be loyal to our values when we need to sacrifice something to respect them. And the question is still open. If some countries, like my country, Poland or Hungary, if they are ready to sacrifice their political interests or political beliefs to be loyal not only to a common money, common interest, but also to our common values. And this is for me the maybe even more important question than the financial aspect. And if you allow me, because I'm absolutely sure that, as I said, pandemic showed how, to all of us, how important is this moral and ethical dimension of politics, and how important is to this, you know, that we have to be vigilant when it comes to not only when it comes to our health or economy, but also when it comes to our values. Why it is so important in this time? Because some of our politicians, some of political parties, they want to use pandemic also as opportunity to strengthen their power, sometimes against their own people, citizens, and for sure sometimes also against our values like rule of law. And this is why it is so important to invest in this, in the Next Generation program, that we have to invest our time, our energy, but also our money, also to restore and to protect democracy and the fundamental values, fundamental for all kinds of democracy, which means that not only, you know, climate, energy, but democracy as such need also our protection, our actions, our money. And yeah, because recovery, this is something for sure wider than only economy.
Indeed, Mr. President, as you said, and I really cannot agree more, more empathy is needed among the EU member states, but also the solidarity is not needed only during those dense times for the European Union, but beyond. You said money is one of the solutions, meaning the recovery fund, and we know there are also efforts in the European Union of connecting the EU long-term budget also with the rule of law and some other aspects of it. But according to you, how could we further strengthen the feeling of solidarity among the EU member states besides using recovery instruments and so on?
You know, I don't want to be too theoretical or too philosophical, but for sure I feel I can say about myself that I am an expert when it comes to solidarity because of my life, because of the whole history of also my country and my activities when I was 20, 25 years old guy. It means solidarity as a movement, solidarity as a way of thinking, as a moral need, and it's something very emotional, but also as a very pragmatic way to achieve something very concrete. And this is what I experienced in my life in the 80s and 90s of the 20th century in Poland. That solidarity is not only something very positive, but maybe too idealistic. Solidarity can be also a permanent method how to achieve our goals, under one condition, that we feel as a community based on common values. I know it sounds like slogans, but it's true. The question today is if we want to keep the solidarity as a permanent approach, we need to answer the most important question: what does it mean to be European? Why solidarity is so important for the Europeans? Because if we want to build a real political entity, that to have Europe as a political entity, and a genuine, authentic identity, it means in Europe not common religion, not common interest only, because we have also very different interests, not common history, traditions, or race, or no. It's the set of values and solidarity, freedom, respect to weaker people, human rights, freedom of speech, it's a rule of law, of course. It's not an empty words. This is, without this, we have no chance to build any sort of European identity. And this is why we have to think about solidarity as, in fact, the only way to survive as a political and moral community in these very difficult times. And the second thing, it's why solidarity is so important, because this is also a skill very important in time when everything can change in 1 second. I mean, you know, solidarity as a reaction for one catastrophe, it's something very easy, in fact. But today, you know, we are talking today not about one black swan. In fact, we have flocks of black swans, and this is also our future, which means that solidarity is also important for us as a permanent skill, as maybe the only method to be fit, to be ready to fight against unexpected situation. Because what we can expect today is something unexpected. And we will survive only when we are fit enough, we are ready, also in the moral sense, emotional sense, to present this permanent solidarity, as I said.
Thank you. Very interesting takeouts that I would like to also follow up by the end of our interview of your political experience back from your times in Poland. We will come back to that. Now I'd like to move on to the next topic, which would be the transatlantic relations and the US presidential victory of Joe Biden that brought indeed new impetus for the EU-US relations. President Biden also recent first overseas trip was indeed to Europe, and it showed and confirmed America's renewed commitment to its allies and partners. How do you characterize President Biden's recent visit to Brussels?
Yes, I have my own very personal image of Joe Biden. I have known him for so many years, and I can say that we are really an old good friends. Also during his term as vice president and me as Polish prime minister, and my assessment and also my emotions when it comes to Trump's presidency. And it's not so easy for us, I mean for our political family, to be enthusiastic because of this change, because our natural partner in the United States was almost always were the Republicans. It's for me also a very intensive, also when it comes to emotions, political experience, that in fact I am, in this American terms of this, the sense of this term, I am Democrat now in the
US relations.
In fact, the first time in my life. But why it is so important? Because first of all, Trump's presidency changed not only our opinion about America and about American Republicans, but in fact it changed also Republicans in America, unfortunately. Second, Joe Biden is really dedicated to transatlantic relations. For me, this is the condition also to survive. It's a question about our civilization based on freedom. It's not, it's something really genuine, authentic. I mean, my opinion, that without this level of solidarity, because we have to say about solidarity also in this context, we have no chance in confrontation with authoritarianism, with this new wave of very brutal, this biological, natural politics we can observe today around the world. And I'm ready to say very openly that we have to be aware that anyway we will have a kind of political, I hope only political confrontation, and a permanent confrontation with Chinese way of thinking about politics or Russian approach. And for this we need this transatlantic unity anyway. And what is one of the most important aspects of this is this readiness, and Joe Biden I hope so, will be here very consistent, is that we need to base this new transatlantic solidarity on this democratic set of values. This idea to build a democratic league or democratic alliance, this is something absolutely crucial to to reorganize, to recompose, and to stabilize the relations between the EU and America. My impression after his visit here, and
Yes.
I'm a little bit sad that some of our colleagues, also in our EPP family, they are ready to discuss mainly about this competition between the EU and the United States. Also in the context of the last meeting between Biden and President Putin. You know, who is the first, who is more important. I think that it's just details. It's not, what is the most important thing is not to think about our relations as a competitor. Even sometimes the Washington is a much more difficult partner than we expected before. But anyway, this must be our priority. For sure you remember this very extravagant ideas about this new strategic autonomy of Europe, understood as a independence from the United States and closer to Russia or more generally to Asia. These ideas of Eurasia, one continent from Vladivostok to Lisbon, etc. Okay, it's very maybe idealistic, maybe, but it's very, very extravagant and for me also unrealistic. We have to base our policy and our, international activities on this old good idea that we need partners which share our values and that we know that it's something genuine and authentic.
I couldn't agree more. And you already said that you had a prominent role during Joe Biden's vice presidency. You were prime minister in Poland from 2007 to 2014. Then afterwards, you were the president of the European Council during Trump's presidency. So you also had to work with him. And I came across your tweet from your statement, actually, back then, where you said, I quote, "I'm not 100% sure that we can say today that we have a common opinion about Russia." And you also already mentioned Russia, so I would like to know if you see it differently today. And if not, what must be done on both ends, on the US and the EU end, to meet and to adopt the same position on Russia and on the geopolitical position towards Russia?
It's more difficult than I thought just after the victory of Joe Biden, because what I feel today is that, and this is obvious on both sides of Atlantic. I mean, what we need is to stabilize our communication about Russia, and what I would expect from Joe Biden is maybe more consistency and more stable opinions about Russia. Because to name President Putin as a murderer, as a criminal, for some good reasons, and then after 2 or 3 weeks to pretend in Geneva that okay, we can talk as partners and it's more or less, we can continue business as usual, etc. This is something a little bit surprising for me, because what we need is a very stable, consistent, tough, but pragmatic approach towards Russia, and orchestrated between the EU, between Brussels and our national capitals and Washington, because we have no chance to compete with them. I mean, with Russia and China, because we have to be aware that they are our challengers and challenges, not our friends or close partners. And for this, we need this unique unity between this transatlantic and even wider alliance of democratic countries. And Trump's lesson is also about our internal politics. This virus, because for me this is another virus, also really, really dangerous when it comes to our everything what is important in our life, because this new political era with such an extravagant and also very attractive, very spectacular leaders like Trump or Boris Johnson in England. But we can find more and more this new type of leaders. But I think for us it's really important to understand that politicians who care about traditional values, important not only for Christian democracy, but especially for us, they have to adapt also themselves to this new political era. It means that, this is also my lesson from my presence here in Brussels, that as Erich Fromm said, that boredom is one of the most painful thing we can experience. In hell, you can be sure that
you will be bored.
If you think about punishment in hell, the boredom is can be one of the most painful. And in politics, boredom is a sin. I mean, if you are boring as a politician, if you are not able to adapt for this new technological revolution, and because it's a new era, impressions are much more important than facts. It's very difficult to find the truth in this very egalitarian agora, which is the internet today. If you are not able to attract the attention, if you are not spectacular enough, you have no chance to compete also for your values. It means that, and this is also the lesson we witnessed during the Trump presidency, but also during Brexit and also some internal problems here in Europe.
To end off this interesting topic on transatlantic relations, I will quote you again, saying, just like Russia, China is our strategic challenge rather than our strategic friend. Moving on, just quickly maybe on the EU-UK relations. UK is not longer a new member state, and now obviously we have to re-establish our trading agreements, trade and cooperation agreement being approved by the European Parliament again on the April 27, just about 2 months ago. And you know Boris Johnson pretty well. According to your opinion, what is his strategy?
He's still Prime Minister, and it means that I have to be elegant, and I'm not sure that Boris Johnson has a strategy in the context of Brexit. And this is what I know from the very beginning of Brexit process, is that there was no plan and no strategy. It was just a political trick, political idea to mobilize the Tories party and public opinion. It means, and still, I am absolutely sure that there's no strategy. It's just a tactics, how to win something in a very internal sense, something political in the context of Brexit. But the mid and long-term perspective when it comes to Brexit is. It's obvious for me. It's Brexit. The nature of Brexit is are barriers and borders, and in this very place in the world, it provokes potential conflicts. And it's obvious that the Irish question is today again very hot because of Brexit. Mm-hmm. It means that we can expect, unfortunately, only problems to solve. Of course, it's our role to if not to solve, but at least to ease some problems provoked by Brexit. But the nature of Brexit will be the same, like in the beginning. It's about negative emotions, about borders, about barriers, and in the center of this problem, of course, about unfortunately, again, Irish question.
President Tusk, I could indeed sit here for hours, and I'm sure the audience could also listen to you for hours because of your really rich political experience. To finish off this interview, I would like to talk a little bit about your political experience and when you came to Brussels 7 years ago. In line with that, would you say that the European centre-right is equipped for the current challenges? And as I can already say or predict that you would say yes, what makes it properly equipped?
As I said just 5 minutes ago, I don't like this new speak or empty slogans or very procedural language, sometimes typical for Brussels bubbles and it's understandable. This was my first impression when I came from Poland, from the national politics here to Brussels, that because the place is dedicated for preparing compromises, procedures, rather to diminished conflicts and emotions. And yeah, this is the role of Brussels and of our institutions, but at the same time it can be boring, less spectacular. It means also less authentic. And this is one of the main reasons why people are so skeptical towards Brussels, because it's difficult. It's hardly in fact, it's impossible to understand politics without genuine emotions. And the Brussels political life this is not the emotional one, to put it mildly. And but going back to your main question. Are we equipped as a centre-right for the future? It's still an open question. Of course, my formal role should, mobilize me to say, yeah, we are. But I want to treat also our talk as seriously as possible. It means that it's still a task. We have solved one really important problem. It was our infights with Fidesz and with ideas about illiberal democracy symbolized by Viktor Orban and his politics in Hungary. And this was a real problem for us, because how to protect traditional center-right and right values in Europe, and at the same time how to protect liberal democracy as the best possible political system. This is one of the best humane invention, I think, in politics, and we did it. It means that, but it's too early to say that okay, we succeeded in every other aspect. For this, we need our Congress, and this is I treat this Congress also really seriously. It's a political one. It's not about procedures and my the advice,
yes,
after my experiences in Poland, on the national level of politics, and now in Brussels and in EPP, and also to our younger colleagues, and please be always as natural, as authentic, as emotional as possible. We will have no chance to win against the main political threats around us without genuine emotions, without this readiness to say the truth, even if sometimes the truth can be very painful. And if you will be courageous enough to be spontaneous and authentic, you will win, with my very little hope.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm taking the note, and I'll be spontaneous as well. I'm a quick learner. So, Mr. President, we cannot neglect the obvious, and this is that you are passionate not only about Greek ancient history in general, but also about football. And we know with the Euro Cup at the moment that is going on, would you maybe like to say who are you cheering? Which team are you cheering up? Or in case, if you would just say, what were your predictions be? Who would win?
As I said, we have to be authentic and emotional. It's clear that because Poland is not is eliminated, unfortunately. But I am a Belgian also in some sense because I am resident in Brussels. It means that for me, Belgium is my favorite. And it's a quite... it's good enough, you know, to be that it's not on an idealistic approach.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. President. It was my honor. Dear ladies and gentlemen, this was our exclusive one-on-one interview with the European People's Party President, Mr. Donald Tusk. Thank you, and I'm giving the floor back to Anna.
Ladies and gentlemen, what an impressive exchange of views indeed. We will now take a short break and see you back at 12 for the last panel of the forum. Stay with us. Dear guests, we have arrived to the last panel discussion of the European Ideas Forum, a geopolitical European Union towards greater autonomy. To keep the debate lively, I invite you to use the hashtag EIF21 on social media by leaving your comments and questions, and we'll post you the last slideable of the day with the code EIF21. The EU needs to become more technologically autonomous. We look forward to our last panelist shedding light on these important topics, and for that, I'd like to introduce the moderator of this discussion, the Executive Director of the Martin Center, Tomi Huhtanen. Tomi, over to you.
Thank you, Anna. And dear friends and dear online viewers, European Ideas Forum is moving on, and we have our fourth panel, and hopefully the most interesting one, a geopolitical European Union towards greater autonomy, ? So already during these 2 days, we have had interesting discussion. Yesterday, we discussed about global power balances, the new setting between China, United States, and Europe. And just some minutes ago, we had our panel on digital issues, digital transition, and very, very interesting interview of EPP President Donald Tusk. Now, in this panel, we surely take many of the elements of the previous discussions. So, of course, geopolitical European Union or geopolitical Commission, it was ambitious term, or is ambitious term of Commission President von der Leyen. And of course, when you speak about geopolitics, what often comes to your mind is broader borders and hard power. But the reality is that today, and especially in the post-pandemic world, it's so much more. It has a dimension of geoeconomics, which is clearly in fluctuation as we speak. And of course, you know, the digital dimension. Those are the issues we are going to very much focus on our debate today, but not to forget the security aspect. And for our discussion, we have 1 hour, and we have 4 very interesting and important speakers. First of all, Kyriakos Pierrakakis, Minister of State and Digital Governance of Greece. Welcome. Nice to have you here in our discussion. He has very elaborated political career. I could mention here, as we are in Brussels, he also worked in a previous professional life as advisor for Anna Diamantopoulou. And as we are in the think tank meeting, I have to mention that he was director of research of Dianeosis, which is an independent think tank. So it's good. Former think tanker in the think tank forum. It's an excellent combination. Then we have Mrs. Henna Virkkunen, who is a second-term, very influential Finnish MEP in the European Parliament. She was formerly Minister of Public Administration and Local Governance in the government of Prime Minister Jyrki Katainen, and is very much on the debate on now what is going in the European Parliament, the discussion on the Digital Services Act, and very talk leader on the topic. So. Welcome. Then we have Mr. Arnaud Danjean, French MEP. He chairs a very important subcommittee on security and defense and the Foreign Affairs Committee of the European Parliament. He's also a member of the Committee on International Trade, which is of course very relevant for our discussion today. Speaks a lot about EU-US relations, very much, which has been one current topic, I would say, during this whole forum. And also in the EPP group presidency is kind of responsible of the relations to think tanks and foundations, and so very close friend to us. And then the fourth speaker with Torsten, with Torsten Küpper. He's Senior Director in Government Affairs, here with me in the studio of Qualcomm, which is international technological company of semiconductors, doing semiconductors, software and services in wireless technology. And of course, on all the issues what we are speaking about, the crucial role have private companies, entrepreneurs, especially when we speak about digital transition. So up we go to the debate. So first I would like to set a question to Minister. Minister Pierrakakis, in this panel, we are going to discuss about United States, China, Europe. But how well these ambitious of the European Union respond to national reality and work what you're doing? Let's say, and this challenge is not only in Greece, it's in every EU member state. So let's say, when we speak about digital transition, I guess in Athens area, the concepts are quite clear, but the situation and the challenges can vary bit different when you start to go to North Larissa, Trikala, or Peloponnesos, distant villages, not to mention the Greek islands. So what is the connection, this big global ambitions, what we are speaking about today, and really the national reality and the challenges which we have to be facing, or we are facing international level? Minister, floor is yours.
Thank you so much. First of all, congratulations to the Martin Center for today's organization. It's, I think, quite crucial to discuss those specific debates. And I would claim, apart from the fact that you're extremely well aware of Greece's geography and challenges, that to a certain extent, certain things overlap. There is an element of complementarity, there is an element of subsidiarity. I would say that overall, the digital policy, for instance, that we have crafted at the national level, which we have published in a document which we call the Digital Transformation Bible, is very much in parallel with what is being discussed and regulated at the Brussels level. I think it's quite crucial to note that the EU is a regulatory superpower, and those decisions crafted and developed at the EU level are extremely significant to create, let's say, the level playing field for all member states to compete properly at the global landscape. And that most of those questions, even though, they have a high-level agenda, AI, for instance, that, as you mentioned, or debates on 5G, or debates on EU identity, the implementation of digital, and this was a lesson of the pandemic, I would also claim, is very much a daily life element. For instance, in the Greek case, what we did was that we took an already existing strategy, that of process simplification, that of eliminating bureaucracy, that of making a different interaction between the state and the citizen leaner. And in reality, this was very much not a high-level technological debate, but a daily life debate. All these technologies, identity, AI, 5G, all the emerging fourth industrial revolution technologies, at the end of the day, touch upon the daily lives of citizens and corporations. And this became even more apparent, even more vivid during the lockdowns and during this very much challenging time period that we are facing. So I would claim that this is explicitly why those debates are extremely significant and why we should be participating in them.
And Minister, in this discussion, especially as you mentioned the post-pandemic situation, the concept of digital autonomy, how has it changed during the pandemic for you in your work?
I would say that, in a sense, the devil lies in the detail here, what we mean by the word autonomy. In reality, what we need to do is significant capacity building. We should play to our strengths at the EU level through the regulatory approach in all these emerging technologies. And in reality, what we understood is that certain amongst the emerging technologies or the pre-existing ones that we have need to be properly mapped, properly regulated, and properly driven by the political authorities, either at the national or at the EU level. We saw this, for instance, in telecom networks, where we had significant challenges during the pandemic, and where all networks, while designed for a previous period, had to properly function and operate in a much more challenging period with much higher demand. Everything needed to continue operating properly, and in our case, it did. But overall, we need to focus, for instance, on AI, on 5G, on identity. Those are enablers for the period to come. And on all other technologies, we need to place our values in regulation centrally and in crafting specific regulatory and legislative approaches and build upon this. While, on the one hand, we shouldn't put all our eggs in one basket. On the other hand, we shouldn't spread ourselves too thin. We need to focus on a spectrum of things. We need to be very much aware of our values as EU citizens. And then we need to properly capacity build, especially where we're more strong.
Thank you, Minister. We move on debate. Mrs. Virkkunen, you work now, you spend your time on many issues, but especially now on this Digital Services Act. That's on your plate. Very heated discussion. We had just a panel before this, and you see that the emotions can run high. What you are in principle doing is also with your work, you are enforcing something we call Brussels effect. So as discussed earlier, EU is really, some issues it's weak, some issues it's strong, but where it is strong is it is regulatory superpower in a global scale, and so-called Brussels effect. And only a couple of years ago, we could say, you could make an argument that US, because they were less stringent, they were kind of following a little bit more the European Union in the sense, meaning that the companies, international companies, they could not ignore the EU regulations. But in US it was less stringent. But for example, China was more like a rule taker. But since a year and a half, 2 years ago, we see a change. We see a China standards 2035, where you could say that they say intent to set the standards and rules for the technological development. And as referring what the minister said about artificial intelligence, to which we are coming back later. So for you, is this global, in your work, what is the order of sequence there that when we are building and constructing and having this very difficult negotiation on, for example, DSA, DMA, is the global dimension there? What's the relation? Or is the order really that we have to just try to get our own packet together, and with the end result, we try to deal with the global consequences? Mrs. Virkkunen, floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Tommy. And it's very easy to agree what the minister already said, that how much the COVID-19 crisis has been boosting the digital economy. And we can see that how big impacts digital economy is having in our everyday life nowadays. And that's why it's crucial for European Union that we make sure that we have the same rules in offline world and in online world in Europe. And that's what we are doing now through this Digital Markets Act and Digital Services Act. And I think, of course, it's important that we are aware of what is happening in China, what's happening in USA. But I think these regulations, they are not reactions for that. It's just more that we want to make sure that we will have the same rules in offline and online world in Europe. And I think our regulatory framework, it has to be based to European values and our legislation. And that's what we are now doing, that we want to make sure that we are tackling illegal content and services and products from internet. And we want to create level playing field in Europe for everybody who is providing their services or products in the European market. So it's crucial that everybody is respecting our European rules here. But what China is doing and what USA is doing, of course, we have to be aware of that. But I think we shouldn't work in that way that we are just reacting. I think our legislation has to be based to our own values. But how to be competitive in the future? I think it's a big question, because those both markets, USA and Asia, they are developing very, very fast. And one important point, what I want to always underline, is that we should invest much more to research and development. We are often focusing very much to regulation in Europe, and of course it's important. And we, as members of European Parliament, of course, we are decision makers and we are regulators there. But I think at the same time, it's important to remember that investments in the research and development are needed if we want to be competitive in the future in digital economy.
Thank you. Just to take, because you mentioned this interesting, strong phrase that this is not a defensive action. So basically, are you saying that because let's face it, when we speak about Digital Market Act and Digital Services Act, the framing of the debate is often that the main intention of these initiatives is kind of control the big American tech companies. But what you are saying, that this, to understand for you, this is not a fair description of the situation.
I think it's important that we make sure that those big social media platforms, which are mostly American ones, that they are respecting our rules, because now it's more that the users, they have to follow those platforms' terms and conditions. But today we see that those big platforms, they are like public spaces nowadays, and it's important that they are respecting our legislation, European legislation, and also that we can make sure that our values are respected. Democracy, human rights, freedom of speech, important European values, they have to be respected also on those American social media platforms when they are operating in Europe. And then this is, I think, when we speak about content, then and the social media platforms, they are mostly American. But then when we look e-commerce and those players who are now growing very much in that sector, they are mostly coming from Asian countries now. And there it's also important that we can tackle illegal services and products in the European market, that we want to make sure that those operators or players who are coming from the third countries, that they are respecting our rules when they are operating in the European single market. So that is the basis for this regulation, that we want to make sure that same rules in offline and online world in Europe, and everybody has to respect the legislation we have in our societies in Europe.
Thank you, Mrs. Virkkunen. The next one, Mr. Danjean. President Biden was just here in Europe, here in Brussels, in NATO, all that. And now, I guess, as partly also as a reaction for Trump presidency, there's this discussion of autonomy. This autonomy discussion, it's an old discussion, but it's now coming back. Europe needs to be self-sufficient. So especially, how do you see it? And because the major issue is, of course, we become more autonomous, but what does it mean for transatlantic relations? So how do you see it? How do you see it? What are the impact on of course, your specialty security policy, but also digital policy, which as we discussed in the last panel, the cybersecurity, it's becoming a harder and harder topic, and of course foreign policy as such. So I know it's a big question, but we would like to hear your take, Mr. Danjean. Floor is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you for this introduction. I think it's a good opportunity to clarify what strategic autonomy is about, especially in the field of defense, but not only, as you mentioned, digital, trade, everything is important now. Strategic autonomy is not about being protectionist. It's not about being full-fledged independence. It's not about self-sufficiency, total self-sufficiency. Autonomy means autonomy, I would say. It's not full-fledged independence. And sometimes this debate is taken from a wrong approach with some bad faith, I would say, by people who ideologically would assimilate autonomy to protectionism. Autonomy is about doing more things by ourselves, being perfectly aware that we cannot do everything by ourselves, and it's not sane to do everything by yourself in the world in which we live, but it's not sane either to be too dependent on critical technologies, on critical infrastructures, and to rely entirely or almost entirely on some other powers, be there friendly powers, like it is the case with the United States. But I think what illustrated the Trump era is that precisely sometimes even the most friendly ally can become less reliable, be it in trade, where we have seen that the Trump administration had taken action and very discriminatory action against some European products with no legal and strong legal and background, I would say, and that was very irritating on steel and aluminium, for example, when you see that the Trump administration was punishing Europe for so-called security reasons on aluminium and steel. This is something we cannot stand for. And the second issue is, for example, when you had the Trump administration being reluctant to commit clearly to NATO, for example, which is a key alliance for us. So, of course, with the new US administration, things will probably be easier. We will come back to a more conventional, I would say, transatlantic relationship for the better. but we must be, Europeans, ready to face a situation where even our closest ally will not align exactly the priorities with ourselves. So in many fields, we have to become more autonomous, which of course doesn't mean at all being totally separated from the rest of the world, and more specifically from the US. We know exactly what we stand for together, but we must build a partnership which is probably fairer and with clearer views on what we can achieve together. I think in digital, for example, what is really important is about norm, standards, that we have to work together. There is a council that will be set up, a transatlantic structure that will look at that more carefully. I think when we compete with the Chinese, for example, we have to be more cooperative in the norms, in the standards. Otherwise, we will be overwhelmed by what comes from Asia. So these are links for further cooperation. But once again, autonomy does not mean that we will do everything by ourselves. It's just that on critical technologies, on some critical issues in defense, we have to rely on ourselves more and to be less dependent on others, because you never know what others' priorities will be in the future.
Thank you. Are you happy with the space of development? As you well pointed out, this is not, it's strategic autonomy. I think it was really framed by European Commission some 5 years ago. So if you, and for example, in space of security, how happy are you of the speed of the development, Mr. Danjean?
It's a very slow process indeed, because we come from a long time of dependence, I would say. And that was not really on the agenda, as you said, before 2016, the first time that it was recognized that we need to develop our own programs, that we need to address the lack of some technologies, some capacity and capability gap we have in the defense structures and security structures. European Defence Funds was put in place, but it's not fully operational yet. It's a long-term process. That's why also it would be ridiculous to blame this strategic autonomy ambition for what it is not, which is a kind of a cut in the transatlantic alliance. This is not. We exactly know what we want to do with the Americans, or how we depend on them on many fields. So strategic autonomy in terms of instruments and tools, it remains very virtual at the moment. We have to also be very realistic on that. It's an ambition. It's a process going on. It will be a difficult path because we have some choice in investment to be made. You have seen that the European Defence Fund, for example, as an initial ambition was for 13 billion euros for 7 years. Now it has come down to 8 billion euros. With 8 billion euros over 7 years in the defense structures, you cannot achieve so much. I know it might sound shocking for some people because 8 billion euros, it sounds big money, but related to what we have to invest in the defense structures, it's relatively low. And compared to what the US are doing, it's totally marginal. So there is a long way to go, but there are good steps, and at least there is an awareness of the Europeans that we have to do more.
Thank you, Mr. Danjean. Now I turn to Thorsten Küpper here in the studio. Mr. Küpper, you know, China, Europe, United States, lot of things happened in the digital sphere, and a lot of things happening in economy as such, and a lot of discussions, also demands, expectations for the company like yours. So what does it mean? Can you explain that? What does it mean for a company like yours to operate in this changing environment and trying to fix it long-term strategies?
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you for having me here. The pandemic has shown us that technology becomes more and more important, especially in the ICT sector. And together with this, we learned as well in our industry that ICT becomes more and more geopolitical. And this is because of the dependencies. If you talk about telecommunication, ICT, In former generations, for instance, of wireless communication, 3G, 4G, it was about connecting people with each other. But nowadays, in the 5G era, up to the 6G era, technology, wireless technology, telecommunication is about to connect everything what's possible to connect. And everything will become to some extent dependent on access to technology. And that's why technology becomes very, very geopolitical as well. We have seen at first in the supply chains, the first focus was in the start of the pandemic to have access to medical goods, to masks and to ventilators and so on and so far. But very soon we have realized as well that through the pandemic there was an eruption and there were problems in the supply chain as well for semiconductors, what we see nowadays everywhere in the world, and the shortage still continues. And there we have seen what we have built, or the markets, because it was a lack of regulation to some extent, that the markets, if we leave them alone, have built an ecosystem with a lot of dependencies, with a lot of monopoles on small parts, which are very important for global supply chains. And now companies as well as governments are considering all this, accessing their supply chains, what's important technologies, and trying somehow to diversify the whole basket. And this is what will lead to digital sovereignty. As long as you are dependent on the supply of goods from one country, from one region, you are not sovereign because you are really dependent. You have to eat what you get. And this will change in the future, and people are about to change it. But it will take a lot of time, and it's very, very difficult. Something like the TTC, the Transatlantic Technology Council, will for sure help. Because first of all, what we have seen as well, cooperation as well as coordination helps to boost technology even further, to drive standards, because standards, we just heard, it's super, super important, because a standard will define how technology will look like, and how technology will look like will define how we will live in the future. And that's why it's so important that we are aligned and that the European value approach can be seen in standards as well. This is something we see. I'm a European working for an American company, but we see as well, and we welcome very much with both hats on, European as well as working for an American company, that Europe is really trying to bring the values into AI, into technology as such. And through all this, I think something like the TTC and more cooperation and coordination between the US and Europe will really help both camps, so to say. It's a win-win in this regard.
Thank you. You mentioned the supply chains and independency of the economics. If one looks a little bit, for example, let's face it, the United States, there's a very skeptical discourse against China for various reasons, as we know. But in reality, if you look really what is happening at a company level, there's a strong integration. So sometimes you wonder that this whole political discourse, does it really relate to the economic reality, which is very much integrated? So on the supply chains, is there is there a really concern among the companies, multinationals, European companies, about something radical is going to happen, or do you think that there's some basic economic structures which cannot be and will not be touched?
So if we talk about my industry and my company, Qualcomm, so we are a semiconductor company predominantly. So R&D is one part, but what we sell in terms of hardware is more or less predominantly processors. And if we're talking to the supply chain, so China is not so much involved in the production of processors. Predominantly, if you see the foundries, so foundries means the fabrics which are really producing the chips, this is more Taiwan and more Korea, TSMC and Samsung, for instance. The tools which are needed to produce semiconductors within such a foundry are predominantly European and from Japan. So ASML, for instance, is a super important company in terms of providing lithography, which is really needed to produce a chip nowadays. And the design capacity is already in the US. So companies like my company, or I can name them NVIDIA, Intel, AMD, and so on and so forth, they are designing the chips. But then, of course, the design goes to Asia and will be produced there. But you see everywhere foundries, so production predominantly in Asia, Taiwan and Korea. So you see big initiatives in the US as well as here in Europe to build up production capacities as well, because we see currently really a shortage, for instance, for overall as Europeans in the car industry. So an ordinary car, so typical car, needs nowadays 150 chips. And if the companies, the OEMs, don't have access to these chips, they cannot produce cars, which really is a big, big issue. And now I'm talking as a German as well. And you can see, for instance, that the European Commission, Commissioner Breton, they set up this IPSI, Important Project of Common European Interest on Microelectronics, to build design and fabrication capacities in Europe. We will see where this ends, because so you really need to see what you need to achieve. The discussion currently is, if I follow it up right, that Europe tries really to produce high-end chips in the very end, so 2 nanometers, 3 nanometers, 5 nanometers. But currently the industries need more, let's say, middle-class chips, because the very high-end chips you need maybe in a smartphone, in the supercomputers, but Europe does not produce these products. Europe produces cars, automats, robots, whatsoever. So the chips can be a little bit less performant and a little bit bigger. And still, even these chips are produced in Asia currently, predominantly. Maybe Europe should focus on this. Yeah, but it is, as I said in the beginning, a readjustment of supply chains. This is what we can really see in the market.
Okay, thank you very much. We see that the discussion is going to this, EU-US relations, and we go back to that. Let's go with the flow. But before that, we have Anna is giving us. I give floor to Anna. There's some results from the Slido voting, and also some questions from the audience. So, Anna, floor is yours.
Indeed, Tommy, thank you very much. We do have the results of our Slido poll in. So to the question, does the EU need to become more technologically autonomous? The overwhelming majority said yes, but not at the cost of disrupting the prices of trade and flows of manufacturing. Also, we do have 2 questions from our online viewers. The first one is, what structural reforms are needed in the next 10-15 years so the EU can be a more effective global actor? And the second question is, how much does the concept of strategic autonomy imply a change of mindset in the way we as Europeans perceive the European Union as a foreign and security policy actor? So, Tommy, I hand it over to you.
Thank you, Anna. About structural changes and all of that, I would maybe I give floor to the long-term strategy minister. Maybe you could take a floor. I think the question didn't mention the digital, but let's stay on economic digital domain. So 10-15 years. What should be the priorities really?
First of all, let me say that priorities should be synchronized, meaning that we need to orchestrate the priorities across all member states properly in order to implement the plan. I would say that there is a spectrum of necessary conditions in order to conduct this discussion as well. One of them is cybersecurity. It was mentioned before. I think it's quite critical to secure our infrastructure at the European scale. We're doing it on a legislative and regulatory basis, but we need to become extremely practical vis-à-vis securing all relevant infrastructure, not only of the public, but also of the private sector. The NIS directive has been instrumental in this regard, but I think we need to do much more also vis-à-vis investments, and overall regulation should go hand in hand with investments in all these areas. I would say that the second element, apart from cybersecurity, is regulation, and the third one is R&D, properly investing in R&D, again in a synchronized manner across member states. Overall, I would claim that in order to do this, to have this discussion properly, autonomy, and it was echoed before in the panel, shouldn't be viewed as, let's build a European version of X, where X is, let's say, a company or a technology. It should rather be 2 other things. A, let's secure services for our citizens in all relevant technologies, either through their supply chain, let's say, channels or overall. And the second one is, let's participate at an equal footing with other technological, with other players, with other big geopolitical players. And that might mean that we're more strong on certain technologies rather than others, but we properly regulate and secure our systems.
All right, thank you, Minister. And the second question of the mindset, maybe Mrs. Vikkunen.
Can you, Tommy, can you repeat the question about the mindset?
How much does the concept of European how much does the concept of European strategic autonomy imply a change of mindset in how we perceive the EU as a foreign and security policy actor? It's a long question, I have to admit. So a mindset. Yes. So you know, I mean, you know, I guess it's a question of self-confidence also. You know, it's a kind of almost metaphysical question. So.
Yeah. Thank you, Tommy. Yes, and I think that this COVID-19 crisis was some kind of wake-up call also for Europe, because now we were really recognizing that how dependent we are in some critical materials and products from one country or region or producer. So I think it was very welcome wake-up call also, because I think it's important that Europe can stand by itself. But in the same time, of course, it's crucial that it's not turning to protectionism, because I think that really the winning concept also in the future, it will be fully functioning single market and combining that to free trade. I think that should be our future also in Europe. But in the same time, it's important that now we're also looking at that we must seek international partnerships and also diversify our supply chains, because we have to make sure that we are not dependent of any single country. But in the same time, I think it's important that we are active also in our free trade agreements, and we are still very much focusing to our single market and taking care that it's fully functioning also. I think these will be the winning tools for the future. But I think it's important that Europe can really stand by itself more than it was doing before.
Yeah. Thank you, Ms. Virkkunen. I would go with the same question with Mr. Danjean. You know, as I have a Greek minister and a French politician, some weeks ago or some months ago, we had the situation in the southern Eastern Mediterranean, and you know, the tense situation for our fellow Greeks. But it was not really the European Union who was engaging there with the statements. It was the French ship who came to the Greek shores to demonstrate some strength. So you know, there is still this political, psychological gap there. So how? Yeah, it's a big question. How? When are we able to create this necessary mindset to, especially as we speak about security?
I think that it's a question of political will as well. I mean, if you have political leaders in Europe who really wants to achieve some kind of autonomy, who really wants to think by themselves when it comes to international affairs, then it might be possible, whatever the tools will be. The first question is about the political will. My impression over the last years is that too often when a crisis erupts somewhere, even in our vicinity, the first reflex is to look at Washington. What will Washington do? What will Washington think? And autonomy is precisely to be able to assess a situation, what it is about, what is at stake for us first. If we do not have this mindset, then you can develop whatever tools you want. You will never achieve a political policy, a foreign policy and security policy. You first need to want it. And my impression, once again, is that many European leaders turn immediately to Washington. What should we think? What should we think? Even before undertaking something, what should we think? Should we read this situation? No, I think there are ways to assess situation by ourselves. You mentioned Eastern Mediterranean. The French policy of a strong reaction towards Turkey was first a reaction of European solidarity with Greece and Cyprus. And it should not come into question that when a member state of the European Union, which is a club with clear rules, with treaties, when one member of European Union is facing a provocation by a third state, then the entire European Union should align with this member state. It's a question of solidarity. It's written in the treaty. So whatever you think about the Franco-Turkish relationship, about other consideration, the first motivation for France to react like this was European solidarity. And this has to exist as a basement for any policy in terms of security and defense and foreign policy.
Thank you, Mr. Danjean. I would go back because let's stay again because again we went to back to this transatlantic dimension when we speak about where Europe should be. So, Minister, Greece has very specific relations with the United States for various reasons. But two are already mentioned here. One was the whole security policy setting in the region, Turkey, all that NATO, that dimension. So US involvement has been always historically important in that concept, number one. And number two is the demographic factor, is that, there's a huge Greek community in the United States, or generations, and also there's a certain tradition to, Greeks to go to United States, build relations, to educate themselves, as yourself, Minister, by the way. So, Ms. Virkkunen and Danjean made a reference to the United States, and just remembering 1 hour ago, hour and a half ago, we had a very lively debate on the digital transition, and then again about the Digital Market Act. So, long story short, how do you see this, transatlantic dimensions? How do you see the impact of the current Digital Market Act debate, Digital Services Act debate, to transatlantic, relations and the differences on two philosophies of the United States and Europe as it comes to digital world? Minister.
I mean, overall, and I think this is very much underlined by the characterization before vis-a-vis calling the EU a regulatory superpower. We have a very strong relationship with the United States, and we're a very active and historical member of the EU. Those two things are not mutually exclusive. The way in which we set specific questions should be set per se on the questions themselves. So in the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act, the key question here, always, of course, with a primary view towards how to properly serve our citizens, is how to properly regulate specific technologies and specific technological solutions. And in this regard, the questions should be posed and answered. And this is at the benefit of our citizens. So we don't necessarily view the question as politically difficult. We view it as technically difficult. And this is why we are participating very strongly in the debate.
Thank you, Minister. Let's go back to the realities of the companies, entrepreneurs, the basis of economy. So we are all the time in this debate referring to this regulatory power, but especially in digital. And we see initiatives of the companies actually creating alliances, already proposing guidelines for themselves on these issues. And I sometimes wonder, are they kind of trying to replace this possible slowness of the legislator? Not to criticize, because it's very understandable, because when you make legislation, it has to be based on something. But this kind of, the fact that you are kind of moving on, or digital companies have to move on, sometimes, making innovation, new dynamics, and then you have to kind of deal with the legislation, regulatory legislation, which actually yet doesn't exist. So how do you see this challenge for companies?
Yeah, so first of all, people like myself, or my role does exist in order to transfer as well knowledge, technical knowledge, the latest on technology to politicians, to involve them early and to enter into a dialogue, of course, as well with the political ecosystem about what's on, what's hot, and what's need to be discussed as well on the political ecosystem. You always have existing laws, and you operate already not out of the blue, you operate already in an existing framework. But of course, new technologies require adjustments from time to time, because if new technologies really become super special, super dominant, or start to expand into an area where so far regulation was never needed, and it is now at first up to the companies to interpret existing law. Does it meet our requirements? Is it applicable to my technology or not? So this is very, let's say, vague and very difficult to access. And then it happens really that regulation from time to time kicks in a little bit too late. what we see the trend currently is nevertheless that at first the market in our ecosystems starts to develop technology, and then the politicians kick in and start to assess what technologies can do. And we appreciate and we welcome very much how the approach and how the dialogue with the politicians currently works. Especially what we can see is as well that we are turning and moving into a more and more open world with open standards, where we don't have a lock-in, where, for instance, as well in telecommunication, previously we had a vendor lockdown. If you start to build a network with one vendor, it's impossible to substitute it with another one because there is no interoperability. But currently we see as well that the whole world is changing into an interoperable and open system where new starters can kick in and can develop technologies. Sometimes it is a little bit difficult, and it can be as well a burden not to have clear regulation. So this is, for instance, currently we have not only in Europe but as well everywhere in the world a discussion about which technology shall be used and implemented in order to enable cars to communicate with each other. So there are several technical solutions. And in regions like China or in regions like the US, now we have a clear picture because a decision is made which will be the preferred technology, but not so in Europe currently. So, and still, as long as people do not know, will it be technology A or technology B, which will allow here cars to communicate with each other, nobody will invest. And nobody will invest maybe further in R&D specifically for the European market. And this uncertainty can be a problem as well. So sometimes here a clear call and a faster call is needed. And in telco as well, spectrum is super important, but the EC did its job in this regard. So in order to build a telecommunication network, you needed first the frequencies and the spectrum. Without an allocation of spectrum, no hardware. Without hardware, no telecommunication network. And sometimes this lasts too long as well, because it's an auction. Every member state does it differently, and this can be a burden as well for investments into this technology. Yeah. But generally, I think politicians do understand technology more and more. This was different, very different 20 years ago. And so I think the interplay works quite efficient.
Thank you very much. All right, we are approaching to the last part of our debate on this panel, but trying to, we still have a time for one round, and let's try to focus something concrete, more or less. Minister mentioned in his opening statement or intervention the buzzword, and you rest of the panelists, the artificial intelligence. And that's there's a big discussion about that. There's a lot of concerns. What is the position of the European Union of development of it? There's a lot of papers and documents and policies about the issue, but somehow, sometimes you have a feeling that the concrete proposals are in waiting. So, Minister, as you mentioned, the issue of the artificial intelligence, and as I know that you follow also very much on the what's the debate in the United States, what is the China doing? How confident you are, Minister, that the European Union or Europe as such is able to stay in the race, able to stay in the game as it comes to artificial intelligence? Minister, floor is yours.
I am quite confident. Let me just say that in our approach overall, we're speaking about three things when we speak about artificial intelligence. The first one is the necessary condition. Data interoperability, data lakes, big data. And in reality, this is something which many member states have had challenges to do in the past, to properly interoperate systems overall or to create data lake structures. And right now, the EU Digital COVID Certificate is such a manifestation. We have started comprehensively doing this at an EU scale. Data lakes is, I would say, the necessary condition in order to speak about AI properly. The second one is algorithmic AI design and investing in R&D in AI. And this is something which we need to further do in a more comprehensive manner in order to further design the use cases, especially at the EU level, which to a certain extent should also be coordinated, I would say, in every policy area, health, taxation, etc. And the third one, where we can have a significant premium, is again regulation, because there we can place, I would say, we can underline our value system. ethical AI, how we feel that AI should proceed, and what types of areas and what types of questions we should be asking, and which ones should be extremely transparent and which ones automatic. And I think that given what we will decide at the EU level, we will drive the debate to a significant extent, as we have also done with the GDPR in questions pertaining to data and data privacy.
Thank you, Minister. Mrs. Virkkunen, do you share the optimism of the Minister?
Yes, I do. If we are speaking about it, that how competitive Europe could be in AI, so I think we have all the tools and we can be very successful. And I think it's natural that also when we speak about AI, as also other digital technologies, we always have to respect our European values and legislation, and values like democracy and human rights, they have to be respected also in digital world and also in AI in Europe. I think it's clear. But if we speak about it, that to where we have to invest in Europe to be successful, first thing, today we have been speaking very much about regulation. And I think here it's important with all the regulation that we should have always very innovative, friendly regulatory framework, that we have to take care that we are not over-regulating our digital markets. And that is especially now about AI. We shouldn't over-regulate it. We have to give the opportunities for the businesses to grow and invest in Europe. But as it was mentioned already, also legal certainty is needed if we want to boost the investments and innovations in this area. So some rules has to be set it anyway up, that the companies, they can see that to where they can invest in Europe. But at the same time, when we are now looking at the regulation, that it should be innovation friendly, it should encourage the investments and innovations. In the same time, we have to invest much more to research and development. We have to invest in skills, digital skills of the people. And especially now we should pay attention how to encourage more female experts to work in ICT sector. I think here we are very much now lagging behind, and we have to use all the potential we have. And then third area to where we have to invest when we speak about the research, the skills, and then we still need investments in infrastructure, that we have to have very modern and smart infrastructure all over in our European Union markets to make sure that we can be competitive in the future.
Mrs. Virkkunen, just many questions. You know, in a public discussion, it's always many times stated that the fact that in Europe we have very different privacy rules as it comes to data, it hinders us in this competition, in this race. Do you know how much do you agree or do not agree with that claim? Very shortly.
Yeah. Yes, in EPP Group, we have been supporting the idea that we should look GDPR in that perspective now, because it's setting some obstacles now for the use of AI. But the majority of the parliament wasn't willing to do that yet. But I think EPP will be pushing that anyway, because we think that now GDPR, there is that kind of consequences which are a little bit setting obstacles for the development of AI, and that should be avoided in the future. So hopefully we can revise the regulation in the coming years.
Thank you. Mr. Danjean, also with the artificial intelligence, and there I take the security aspect. As I have understood, in the United States, when working with artificial intelligence, this military aspect was taken in from the very beginning. But that doesn't seem to be the case in Europe. Do you see an issue there, a possible challenge? Should we, this hard security aspect, should we keep it in mind when we are speaking about military capabilities in Europe?
Well, I think precisely this is a challenge that the new tools at the European level in the field of defense investment, especially in R&D, this is something that will be taken into account. And the new tools are precisely here to help us filling this gap that has been developing with the US. But I very much agree with the two previous speakers. The key is a right balance between a massive investment policy that we need, especially in R&D, and regulation, and working on the legal framework for all this. Because too often we in Europe, we give the impression that we are focusing more on regulation than on investment, and therefore that we are lagging behind in terms of competitivity and in terms of innovation. That's critical. And discussing with our US counterpart, there is sometimes this feeling that US is going very far in terms of investment, less on regulations, and we are doing the contrary, regulation without investment or with too little investment. So the right balance between these two dimensions is critical, and that will be where we have to discuss a lot with our US friends, I think, both in the tech sector and in the legislative bodies, because the cooperation will be crucial to strike the right balance between us, US and Europe, and also between the two dimensions, the financial one, I would say, to feed the innovation and the regulation, both in terms of technological standards and legal framework.
Thank you, Mr. Danjean. Mr. Cooper, again, the eyes are on the private sector. So what it would be, we hear about ambitions, there's a concern, artificial intelligence, Europeans want to stay in the game. So what it would require from how can the public sector legislator help the companies that these ambitions can be fully fulfilled in Europe?
Yeah, so first of all, we need incentives as global operating companies to carry out R&D and to invest in this technology in Europe. And this is what Europe, of course, wants. Intensive is not only funding, it's not only a tax benefit, it is as well stuff like, for instance, patent protection. That you have a clear and a strong patent protection system in place that I know if I create R&D in Europe, that they will be protected, they will not be exploited by third parties without paying licensing fees, that I can monetize it and take the money which I get from licenses and invest it in future inventions and in new R&D. So this is one very important, I think, criteria for investments at all for companies, especially global companies like my own company, because usually really you can really choose where to invest finally. And of course you want in this regard a stable ecosystem. The second I would say as well, you're absolutely right, over-regulation is a problem from time to time as well, especially in the field of AI. You can see it, so if you have to train your systems and you need a lot of pictures, face recognition. My company is not involved in this, we only do hardware, but I'm telling here from the industries, sometimes it's too difficult in Europe. People then go to India, go to China, go to Africa and do the trainings there because there's less data protection. I don't want to say that we should soften our laws, but maybe we need an international system or an international agreement or commitment at least, how this will be sorted out in the future. As I said, we are not involved in this business. We are doing more the hardware side of this and AI related to hardware. But there you can see that at least the ecosystem must be attractive as well, that you have access to the information. And this leads as well to data pools, what we have just met, that data's interoperability can be exchanged easily here in Europe. And maybe a last sentence, talking about AI, of course, I think that Europe should focus on fields of activities related to AI, where Europe has a unique value and where it's not easy to substitute the European ecosystem. And this is for overall in production and in B2B business and B2B data. And to bring this together with AI cannot be done everywhere. It is more or less something where definitely Europe has a value proposition which should be exploited from the European Commission. So this is what I would focus on. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Cooper. Now I'm looking at the watch, and watch is ticking. We have only a few seconds left, so it's my time to conclude our very interesting panel. We could continue forever, but I have to bring it to close. I think, if one takes one point, I think which came very strongly through on the whole discussion and from the panelists, is that the fact that being autonomous, being self-sufficient cannot mean that we are closed, that we are protectionist. I think what in the essence what the panelists were saying, that okay, we can say that we are now living a period where it is less multilateral and more multipolar, but we cannot in the European Union adapt the strategies of the big nation states like China, like United States, because in essence the European Union is not the nation state. We are built on openness and we are built on multilateralism, and so we should promote this in a global landscape. But of course, as the panelists mentioned, not to be naive. We have to be careful in certain sectors. We have to be able to function as Europe also if there's some disruption in the global chains and connections. And maybe the last point, I think what the panelists were saying is that whole this discussion about the external strength, it is only where, it becomes academic unless it's based on internal reality. So the stuff what we are doing in the European Union, working on our relations, working on our industry, which we are doing very hard. So I would like to thank very much you online viewers. It's a busy times. You were there for your questions. I would like to thank Qualcomm for contributing to this panel, so making this whole setting possible. And of course, dear panelists, thank you very much for sharing us your ideas and your opinions, and we are very much looking forward to continue this debate. So thank you very much, and floor is yours, Anna.
Thank you, Tommy. This was such a great panel to end our day with. However, dear viewers, we still have a few highlights for you. We will be back shortly with our keynote speaker. Stay tuned. Welcome back, everyone. Now, it is my pleasure to welcome the chairman of the EPP Group in the European Parliament, Manfred Weber, for his keynote address. Mr. Chairman, the floor is yours.
Share with you some of the considerations we have from a group's point of view in mind when we speak about this next chapter of the European Union, the next decade in front of us. And I'm sure that you already had the chance in this modern format of exchanging views and the already discussed issues, that you already have a lot in mind what we have to do for the next upcoming years. And that's why I try to focus on probably some of the elements I personally would highlight. But before I do so, I want to thank the Wilfried Martens Center very much for this kind of activity, again, to bring the European Ideas Network back, to really find a new way to organize these things in the COVID times, and also to keep also the innovation out of these COVID times, but in digital form. So congratulations to all your efforts. And for us as EPP as a whole, it's extremely important to have this network of the Wilfried Martens Center to be engaged and to connect to the outside world about our EPP internal discussion. So thank you so much. So the first question is, when we speak about this decade in front of us, when we speak about the need to reform Europe, when we speak also about the Future of Europe conference in front of us, then the first big question is there a need? And I hope that everybody agrees that the answer is clear. There is a need now to open the window and bring fresh air into the European Union and allow us, as those who believe in this idea of a strong European Union, to consider what are the next steps now in front of us. What does the next decade brings for us in Europe? And probably the key method is that we are not anymore driven by crisis management, because frankly speaking, that was the experience of Europeans in the last 10, 15 years. When you see the Euro crisis, migration, we had Brexit and now Corona crisis, we always reacted after a huge challenge, a big crisis. And that's why to overcome this and to discuss today what is in front of us and what do we have to answer today to avoid or to better answer the next challenges in front of us is exactly what we have to do. And therefore, again, the Future of Europe conference is a key tool for doing it. That is what we see. I tell you that when we had the first meetings now in this format of Future of Europe conference, then I feel already a kind of a Strasbourg spirit, because a few weeks ago we had the first meetings there, and we also had in the EPP format the first caucus meetings, the first group meetings of the EPP delegates there. And you feel motivation, you feel fresh ideas. We had also last week a meeting with our head of states and governments in the EPP summit format chaired by Donald Tusk. And also in this summit, there were colleagues showing up and contributing to fresh ideas about the future of Europe and to try to find a way to keep as EPP the ownership on this debate about the next chapter for the European Union. So that's why the spirit is there, the chance is there, the opportunity is there that we make out of these discussions a real success story. And let me also add that when I discuss with people about the chances, it's really a possibility to upgrade Europe now, to bring Europe to a new level, to innovate things. Then there is some reluctance, especially on council side, when I see the preparation of the Future of Europe conference there. But I would say that next spring, having in mind that we want to finalize then the first reports on the future of Europe, we have still Macron in office, who is really committed to the process, and we will have most likely Armin Laschet in the German chancellery sitting there as the next chancellor, hopefully, as the next chancellor, and he's also clearly committed to bring Europe to a new level. And I would say with these two leaders, I think we can create a momentum. It's not in us, that's clear. We need all Europeans to be part of this, all head of states and government, but the momentum from Paris and from Berlin can help us a lot. So that is my starting point. There is a chance, there is a good spirit, there is a momentum. Let's use it. Let's open the doors, the windows, and let's get fresh air into the room to discuss about what is needed. We start with citizens, with listening to the citizens. That is what we are doing there. And that is good. Modern politics starts with listening. And as politicians, we know how important it is, especially as People's Party. We know how important it is to be in close contact with our citizens. In this format, I would say that we have to tackle especially the items, the content of politics, which is close to the EPP mind. I tell you, for example, still safety, security, fight against terror is one of the elements where people, especially EPP-minded voters, have an interest, have a demand towards Europe. I tell you that I think that the biggest challenge for us will be jobs, jobs, jobs. The economic dimension of the developments must be in the center of our discussion. We lost last year 6.5% of GDP. We can win back a lot after we have now the rollout of the vaccination in a positive way managed, but still the decline is tough, is strong. And we have to create jobs, especially for our young generation, to avoid another lost generation. That is a second aspect I want to mention. And for sure, there are future aspects which we have to talk with citizens about, health, for example, and still migration. So let's focus on the points where especially we as EPP know that people are expecting us to move and to deliver as European Union. Frankly speaking, this is an important step, listening with citizens, the dialogue, yes. And Dubravka Suica is a key person in this regard, in this subject. She is organizing this from a Commission point of view. And that again is a precondition for modern forms of politics. But frankly speaking, the real exercise, the real challenge for us as politicians is then afterwards to discuss the how. So not so much the what is needed, what are the demands of people, what are the concerns of people, but then to make the implementation, to make Europe capable to deliver. So the how must be in the center of the debate in the second phase of this Future of Europe debate. What is in my mind when we talk about the how? I tell you that, yeah, first of all, it's again about politics, so climate change, Fit for 55 package, on health. You know that EPP, we fought already in the last campaign for strong ambitions on cancer, on fight against cancer, to beat cancer. And now Corona gave us a proof that we need more Europe in this health issue to create a real health union. Then we have, again, social market economy to redefine what it means, SME, the question of absorption rate of our money, a question of bureaucracy, young generation, and so on and so forth. So that is how the subjects on content. A second element on this how is that we need on European level to consider that for the moment, Europe is strong as a legislator. So Council, Commission, Parliament, we create a common legal framework for our market, for how we live together in Europe. But Europe is currently not capable and strong enough in the implementation of things. So in the executive side of a governing structure, there I see a lack, and there I see a need of improvement. For example, when we define in European level that we have to have strong border control, then we have to have also strong Frontex to do it practically, and to have the right to step in and jump in if national level is not capable to deliver. Today we have in Greece a government with Kyriakos Mitsotakis who is ready to defend our European border against illegal migration. But this was not the case in the previous government. And if a government is not ready to implement existing legal obligations from the European level, existing law from European level, then the European level must have the right to step in and to say, sorry, we take over and we send then Frontex troops to the border and protect our borders. So this is only one example for the fundamental question, do we need more executive power on European level? So not first of all more Europe, but first of all a more effective Europe to really deliver. Another element which is in my mind is absolutely the global dimension. I think you discussed it already. Because that's the biggest field where we see the need that Europe must go further, must be strengthened. And it is about the common defense pillar. We in the group, we consider, for example, to establish a kind of a cyber brigade to defend our internet infrastructure in the European Union together as one possible first step to establish this defense pillar. We have now the first time the defense fund on European level for common research activities, and also with PESCO we do something. And the other field on the foreign affairs is obviously the question of the qualified majority decision-making process. To stop unanimous vote, which means blockade in the Council, and really to make it possible for the European Union to speak with one voice, with one strong voice on global level. And having now Russia in mind, having Turkey in mind, having Venezuela in mind, and the big question China in mind, we need this common voice urgently. Let me also underline in this field where I see the need of a further strengthening of Europe, that we have to talk about the democratic Europe. You know, we failed last time with the idea of a Spitzenkandidat, of the idea that we present before the elections to the voters who is the candidate and what is the program behind the personality. Is having now the development of 2019 in mind, we first have to consider, is the idea behind still right or is it wrong? I would say the idea is still right. It's the same on local level, on national level, that you present a candidate and have a program. That's a basic principle of democracy. So to make Europe more democratic, we don't have to innovate so much. We have simply to do the things we also do in local, regional, and national level. And that's why I would stick to this principle. But we have to consider how to make it more binding, how to make it real, how to make it, to bring it alive. That is a challenge in front of us. And there we have to talk together with Council, together with all representatives, how to make it possible. The dimension, the importance of this subject cannot be underestimated. Having Brexit in mind, where Boris Johnson campaigned with, I want to have my sovereignty back. Having this in mind, everybody understands that the direct link between citizens and Europe, Brussels, decision-making level, must be direct, must be close. People must feel involved. People must feel that this is my Europe and not a distant Europe. That's why I really think that this is one of the key priorities. I myself have the chance as a coordinator in the Working Group for Democracy in the Future of Europe conference to present then the final draft for the democracy chapter, and we must do our best as an EPP family to bring this alive. And I invite everyone to also contribute now with ideas. You know, there is a debate about the transnational list on the table. There is also the debate about the direct election of the Council President to elect a president for the European Union on the table. So, well, very far-reaching ideas, but I think that is exactly what we need. So ambitious approach for the future and new considerations. Probably not everybody agrees, but again, a debate starts with creative ideas. And finally, all the debates about future of Europe, about the next decade in front of us, must be linked to our value base, about the European way of life. We introduced as EPP this framing of European way of life. It was highly controversial when Ursula von der Leyen presented Margrethe Skinas as the vice president responsible for promoting the European way of life. It was highly controversial. The left didn't like it. But we fought for it because we need this identity, common understanding what makes us to be Europeans. And I want to share with you the basic principles. We know them, but it's important to remember them. It's also about the democracy question. It's about rule of law. It's about the social market economy, about equal treatment of men and women. It's about the death penalty, that we have this all over Europe not allowed and forbidden. And we have then above everything the key message, the umbrella for the European values, and that's freedom. That's Europe, and that's unique in the world. That's not in Russia, not in China, not in America, not all over the world similarly established. And that is what must drive us in the next upcoming years. And if you allow me to sum up, we need now again an ambitious approach. We need now the will to do the necessary things. And may I say, even if not everybody in the public opinion supports us, When Adenauer, De Gasperi, Schuman created the European Union, not everybody was convinced about this. When Helmut Kohl, Mitterrand started the euro, I tell you in Germany, not everybody was convinced to give up on the German Deutschmark, but he did it and they did it. So what Europe needs is a good consideration about what is needed to prepare for this next decade in front of us, but then to do it, to have the political will, the courage, the understanding to show leadership. So politics is about listening, but it is also about leadership. And that is what Europe needs now more than ever before in this decade, in front of this decade. And I'm sure that we as EPP, we will be the party of leadership. We will deliver for a good perspective for the European Union. Thank you so much for listening to me, and thank you so much for giving me the chance to present some considerations to the debate.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your words and your inspiration. And last but not least, for our concluding remarks, I'd like to welcome the Secretary General of the EPP and the Secretary Treasurer of the Martin Center, Antonio Lopez Isturiz White, joining us also online. Welcome, Secretary General.
Hello, and good morning or good afternoon, dear President Tusk, dear Chairman Weber, and dear friends from the Martin Center. Again, congratulations for this fantastic gathering in these discussions. Great stuff, good work. The topic of this year's European Ideas Forum could not be more timely. It is imperative that our political family discusses how the next decade will affect our citizens and societies. Due to the pandemic, we face a series of challenges in our society, economy, and future. However, we are also presented with opportunities to articulate these post-pandemic transitions, opportunities to build a sustainable economic recovery, to invest in our future and renew the social market economy. In this sense, I want to echo President Tusk and Chairman Weber's words in saying that our immediate priorities must be the creation of new jobs and the support of the industries most impacted by the pandemic. The pandemic has highlighted, I guess, the importance of sound public finances and the need for member states to respond adequately to unforeseen economic shocks. Our political family will continue to advocate for a governance model based on sustainable public finances and stable prices. For that purpose, a key element of Europe's recovery will be small and medium-sized enterprises. It is SMEs that drive our economy, creating jobs and bringing new products and services to our markets. As they rebound from the pandemic, it is more important than ever to ensure that the EU legislation does not put obstacles in their way, but in fact enables them to get the financing they need to start up and to scale up. International trade will also play a key role in the global economic recovery. This is why we must remain strongly committed to an open multilateral system of free and fair trade. Yesterday at the EPP Political Assembly, we approved a policy paper where we make this very clear. If the European Union wants to be a global player, we need to strengthen our trade relations with the world. We need to connect our trade and foreign policy agendas. We need to solve our trade disputes with the United States and strengthen our transatlantic partnership. We need to consolidate our trade relation with key players and regions in the world. Of course, without forgetting about our values. For instance, we should not ignore the fact that China is sanctioning members of our European family, members of the EPP. This is unacceptable. We cannot forget our commitment with freedom, push our climate agenda, push for democratization and human rights. But of course, not forgetting that we need to engage. If we do not find ways to engage with the South American countries, reach a solution to our negotiations with Mercosur, for example, other than the Chinese, also the Russians, the Iranians will do so. It is a matter of balance and timing. What is certain, however, is that we need a balanced trade strategy as a part of our long-term economic strategy. Nonetheless, the most important component of the recovery of Europe's economy, I think, will be arguably the the European funds. For the first time, the European Union will enter jointly into debt. This is a historical moment for the European project, but it must be met with accountability and transparency. We need to prevent that irresponsible opportunists and populist politicians make questionable use of these funds, which were the result of European solidarity by all EU countries for the benefit of all EU economies and citizens. Thanks God, in some cases, EPP governments, I'm sure, will follow always the EPP line, and we are sure about that. Problem are socialist and other populist governments in some countries in the European Union. The European funds represent an opportunity to transform our economies and societies which we cannot afford to miss. It will enable member states to invest in their future and will help Europe become a leading actor in the transformation. These transitions will not happen in a vacuum. They must happen according to our European model and our European way of life. Indeed, Europe must remain at the forefront of combating climate change, also must gain the position of becoming a leader on innovation and in the digital revolution that is already transforming our industries and our households. But the European model of innovation must be about, and for the people, it must strive to improve the life of our citizens. That is why we want to empower young entrepreneurs. Indeed, the pandemic has increased inequalities across many sectors of our society, but we are committed to renewing our European social and economic model that will ensure that every person will have access to retraining or further education opportunities. Furthermore, we believe in equal opportunities for women in the labor market. We want to make sure that men and women receive equal pay for equal work. Now more than ever, I think also it is important that we protect European social fundamentals and increase living standards to empower families. Job insecurity, the impossibility of affording a house, and the uncertainty for the future too often prevent young Europeans from starting a family. We must build a new ladder of mobility for working and middle-class families. In that sense, to succeed in holding the middle ground, the social market economic model must respond to the needs of ordinary working families. It must never, I think, become a remote concept with little relevance. As the pandemic has shown, the social market economy model must refocus on essential public services that our voters demand. Issues such as affordable childcare, good quality schools, essential public services, etc. Finally, I think that the transition to a post-pandemic world must go hand in hand with Europe's autonomy, an autonomy based upon the EU's capacity to enact its foreign policy agenda independently and effectively. We need a ready Europe that can protect and defend our citizens from any arising menace, such as now the case of Russia, China, with their multifaceted hybrid threats, a European Union that can stand alone and secure its position in the world. Only through all these actions, we will be able to channel these very much needed transitions and ensure a prosperous future in this post-pandemic era. Thank you very much to my good friends in the Martin Center and also to all the participants. Thank you very much for your contribution.
Thank you, Secretary General, for your very valuable words. At this point, I'd like to thank our speakers, our moderators, and especially you, our online audience, for your active participation. If you have missed the debates, they will remain available on our platforms where you can rewatch them at your ease. A big thank you goes once again to AB InBev, Apple, and Qualcomm, who have powered this fully digital European Ideas Forum. Continue to follow in the Martin Center activities to stay informed, and we are looking forward to seeing you at our next events. Have a nice day and goodbye.